Jackal Among Snakes. Author, Nemorosus. Chapter 61, Book Mule. Argrave walked into the branch of the Order in just with long, confident strides, though he had to admit that he felt rather isolated without his two companions shadowing him inside. They were just outside, waiting patiently. Provided Castro sold Argrave's proposition well, Anneliese would be given membership to the Order of the Grey Owl soon enough. The Just branch of the Order was quite a grand place in comparison to the one in Mtlnation. It occupied one of the taller towers in Just. The black interior was just as grim and as the rest of the city, though it was brightly lit by magic lamps. At the center of the room, there was a large spire, a round desk circling around it with many attendants sitting behind. The spire was hollow, and there was one entrance at the front of it. This place lacked stairs just as the Tower of the Grey Owl, and so the central spire housed those floating platforms of stone that would raise one from one floor to the others. They were the only way to move upwards in the tower. He stepped to the desk, and the attendant craned her neck to look up at Argrave's face. "Hello, sir," the woman said somewhat meekly. Argrave didn't recognize her, so she must not have been important. "I have an inquiry," Argrave began without pleasantries, removing the circlet on his head that disguised his features. He stowed it away in his satchel bag and continued, "Has the tower sent any notices regarding the library and an individual by the name of Argrave?" "Oh," she said quickly, taken aback. Yes, they have." "That's me." "Yes," Argrave said with a small smile. "So, then I have free reign of the library?" Argrave looked towards the central spire, preparing to enter. "Hold on a moment." She shuffled through various papers on the desk, and Argrave waited patiently. Eventually she pulled out a piece of a paper. "Apparently, your identity needs to be verified. We'll use your magic signature. So, please empower your badge and stamp here." She held out a piece of paper. Argrave paused, then obeyed her directive, retrieving his wizard's badge. "Hold a moment. They take this signature when you register as an acolyte." "Will this even work?" "What is a magic signature? Where does it come from?" Lacking options, Argrave could only shake his head and will some magic into his badge. It shone, then he lowered it and pressed it down on the backside where it was flat. Blackness spread out across the paper where he'd pressed like a blooming flower. After a moment, the attendant gestured towards him to pull it away, and he did so. She compared it to another piece of paper, looking back and forth between the two meticulously. Argrave felt a little nervous. "Excellent," she said finally, setting both pieces of paper down. "Then that's done." "So, what, I get a library pass now?" "Oh, She paused, shuffling through more papers nervously. "Yes, I think. But I don't think I can give you it. I think you have to get it from the Order branch manager." "Sir, I think that's the case," she said respectfully. "You do a lot of thinking, it would seem," Argrave noted sarcastically. "Can you take me there, or at least think about it?" She blushed and stood from the chair. "Yes, I can take you there. Please follow me." The attendant opened the desk door and walked out from behind it, leading Argrave to the central spire. She pressed on the interface at the side of it, and before long, a wide platform came down before them. She walked on, and Argrave followed after. Soon enough, he felt his feet lock just as before, and the platform began to shift. The desk attendant stared down at the ground, awkwardly silent the whole way. Argrave considered saying something, but then resigned himself to examining the other people moving about in the central spire. They were carried all the way to the top, and Argrave walked out first, waiting for the attendant to take him to the branch manager. The attendant led him to a wooden door and knocked thrice before opening. "Please wait," she said deliberately, then walked inside. Argrave heard a brief exchange between two female voices. After a few seconds she came back out, ushering Argrave inside. He entered. There, a beautiful red-haired woman wearing grey robes waited at her desk. She had sharp features that gave one an impression of fierceness, narrow green eyes, low resting brows, and seemingly naturally pursed lips. "Hello Elaine," Argrave greeted cheerily. "Nice to see you. Here for my library card. Got a few books in mind." Elaine was taken aback when her name was called, and Argrave considered that a good start. In a city like Just abounding with smugglers and wizards, one had to be somewhat ruthless to rise to the position of branch manager, and Elaine certainly fit that bill. She was Rivian's sister and a powerful wizard in her own right. Connections and magical power, that combination was quite potent. At present she was B rank, and in the future she would rise to A. Argrave did not wish to linger long, but he did not wish to offend, either. "So, the world-famous Argrave knows me," she said, matching his cheer and thereby trying to regain control of the conversation. Her green eyes stayed locked on him. "I'm humbled." "Which world am I famous in?" "I must have missed the memo," Argrave returned. "The spellcaster's world, of course," she said with a smile. "Maybe when I'm asked for an autograph, I'll agree with you. For now, I just want to get some books from the library as Castro promised. I'm rather busy, you see. Forgive me." Argrave redirected the conversation away from himself. Yes, I'm told you're quite a... What's the word? Bibliophile." She nodded, rising to her feet. She took something off her desk, but Argrave didn't see what it was and it soon disappeared into her sleeve. "I'm told you even have spellbooks containing druidic magic." Argrave took a breath, considering the implications of her words. He wished to ask if Rivian had told her that, but he stopped himself. Considering her brother is Rivian, it may well be she learned from him. But she doesn't know associated with her brother's smugglers, and it's been only a day. It's unlikely she would have learned already. Considering her talk about my fame, it's much more likely that she learned from other people in the Order. As such, I shouldn't reveal anything. Not have, but had. Argrave shook his head after his correction. I gave them all to Castro. I'm sure that's how you know of this. Argrave lied. Not quite how I learned, no. She shook her head, walking closer while lifting her head to hold Argrave's gaze. She was taller than most, but in front of Argrave near everyone was short. People tell me you still have a great deal. An enviable amount, even. Argrave tried to keep his face neutral. Probably bluffing. Even if she's not, I shouldn't admit it, Argrave reasoned. People say a lot of things, Elaine, Argrave said while sighing. People say that the Crown Prince eats puppies alive for breakfast. Do you believe that? She laughed. Argrave thought it sounded fake. Well, I cannot speak to the prince's eating habits. But I do know this: if you do have any druidic spellbooks and you wish to earn some significant money, you might lend them to me for a day or so. They'll be returned to you, and you'll be able to receive all of the credit and the rewards for submitting them to the Order of the Grey Owl. Your coin purse will be a little fatter, and you'll have all the fame. She held her hand out, a strange metal badge in her hand. It bore an owl's face in gold. Argrave reached out and took it. This is the access I need for the library? Yes, Elaine nodded. It's usually only given to branch managers or the masters of the Order, but Castro made an exception for you. Now, Argrave cut her off. Then, is there any update on whether my friend Anneliese will be given Order membership? The council will hold a deliberation at a later date. Now, back, and that shipment of illusion spellbooks, is it ready? I'm sure Castro mentioned this if he sent out word of my access to the libraries. Argrave interrupted again. No, she said. If she was frustrated by his interruptions, Elaine was quite adept at hiding it. The last of the books are arriving from the tower tomorrow. Now, back to my offer, she said quite deliberately. Argrave stared at her eyes as he considered his answer. Is it even worth considering? She probably won't offer enough money to make a difference, and I take an unnecessary risk. There's no benefit to this deal for me. It sounds like a wonderful proposition, Argrave said, hiding the badge away. But I cannot well knock on Castro's door and demand back what I have already given to him. She clicked her tongue, green eyes locked with Argrave's own. She held out her hand for a handshake. Well, if you change your mind, my offer is always open. If you have no need for money, I can offer other services. Argrave considered that might be an innuendo, but dismissed the idea. Elaine had pride, at the very least. Even if you offer to shine my shoes or clean my house, I simply don't have the books. Argrave shook her hand quickly. Until next time. Branch Manager Elaine. She stared for a few seconds, then nodded. Yes, until next time. Perhaps Argrave imagined things, but her voice sounded somewhat cold. Argrave turned and walked out the door, a smile on his face. Once it shut, that smile vanished. She's definitely going to have her brother spy on me to see if I actually have those books. Argrave reached into his pockets, pulling out a folded-up piece of paper that had a list. Looks like I have another thing to add. Pay a visit to Rivian. Make sure he doesn't help his sister. Argrave sighed, despairing, until he remembered the badge he'd acquired. He took it out and flipped it in his fingers. I've got a golden ticket, Argrave muttered, his smile returning. He set off towards the Central Spire's elevator, whistling the rest of the tune. Argrave figured that, in the remainder of the day, whatever so-called fame he'd accrued at the Order of the Grey Owl quickly became infamy. He spent the remainder of the day hauling out books 4 at a time from the library at the Just branch, feeling no shame at all for the glances cast his way as he did so. At first, no one seemed to care. After the 5th trip, people were skeptical or surprised. After the 15th, there was disbelief and contempt. None could protest in the face of his golden ticket, though, not even Elaine. It was rather amusing to Argrave watching Glimmer's face gradually grow more and more as their bags were slowly filled with books. To his credit, he carried all of them without complaint. Their innkeeper cast them a strange glance at the elf weighed down by dozens of books, but Argrave paid it little heed. Once they were all placed in their dormitory, Argrave took them out of the bags and arrayed them out. You want to draw any more attention to yourself? Glimmer questioned. Hauling hundreds of valuable books about, what were you thinking? I know. Originally I had planned to do this quieter, but something came up. We have to go speak to someone, get some protection, Argrave answered. A man by the name of Rivian. I like him quite a bit. He's the boss of those smugglers. He'll watch our backs, I'm sure. You trust criminals? Anneliese questioned. I trust this one, Argrave said conclusively. He cares about reputation and image, and I can think of some things to leverage over him. Fine. We should do this tomorrow, though. I'll stay here tonight, keep watch. Glimmer nodded. Perfect, Argrave concluded, picking up one of the books. Look at it, Anneliese. It's beautiful. Every C rank and B rank spell we'll be learning, all arrayed before us, completely free, he said, barely containing his excitement. He stroked one of the books. A rank spells are only kept at the tower. Sensible. I suppose we've got warding spells, Argrave listed, pointing at them as he listed them. Elemental spells and healing magic. 3 illusion spells, the rest in that branch are worthless for our needs, he said dismissively. We've got blood magic. We've got enchantment methods, he pointed, grabbing one. Frankly, I don't even know if I should have taken these. Castro only specified spellbooks. But they're mine now, Argrave said with a hysterical laugh. Argrave calmed down, sighing. This is the most fun I've had in a while. I can't wait to crack these open. Maybe. No, I don't think I need to sleep tonight, Argrave nodded. I slept around 4 hours yesterday, that should be fine. Chapter 62, Siblings of Vyrbell. Argrave peered past an iron fence into a well-managed estate garden. It had a fountain, a very brief hedge maze, and at the very back, a rather grand mansion. Evidently a smuggler and a branch manager of the order could grow very wealthy working together. Argrave nodded in recognition, then turned away from the fence, gesturing to Anneliese and Guilliman to follow. He made his way to the gate. A lone knight guarded it rather idly. Hello, Argrave greeted, voice somewhat dull. He had not slept a wink, and as much reflected in his general demeanor. He learned a C-rank warding spell, though, so the effort was not wasted. The knight did not react, so Argrave repeated, hello, louder and more insistently. The knight turned his head to the sound slowly and then came to attention when he saw the 3 of them approaching, placing his hand on the pommel of his sword. This is the estate of Lady Elaine of Vyrbell. Please keep your distance, the knight said loudly. Argrave knew that this was only her estate in name only. Rivian made the majority of the money, but he didn't wish to draw much attention to himself. I see. Well, I wish to speak to Rivian of Vyrbell. I'm sure that he'll want to speak to me. Argrave clapped his hands together diplomatically. When Rivian's name was mentioned, the guard noticeably hesitated, his helmet moving back and forth between the 3 of them. The Lord is likely having breakfast now, the knight said slowly. Just tell him that Argrave would like to see him. I have a matter he might help me with. The knight nodded, then stepped over to ring a bell. A servant from inside the gate came rushing forward in short order, and the knight relayed Argrave's message. Content. He stepped away from the knight, facing Anneliese and Guilliman. Anneliese, keep an eye on the people in this meeting, try to feel out their dispositions towards us. When Anneliese nodded, Argrave squeezed his eyes shut and then opened them, trying to dispel his tiredness. Head's killing me, eyes hurt. At least I'll sleep easier tonight. Argrave focused on the positives. I slept, so I feel fine, Anneliese said pointedly. You should not stay up all night, even if you are having fun. Guilliman eyed the both of them. Fun? You only studied. No, we learned magic, Argrave corrected. In terms of activities, it is immensely satisfying to see one's studies come to fruition. It's like... Argrave searched for the right words. Building yourself, adding to yourself, getting new limbs, new tools, that all exist within your mind. Anneliese nodded, then turned her head to watch the servant that had moved away return. He spoke to the knight, and the armored man nodded. He walked over to the 3 of them, and Argrave turned. Lord Rivian will receive you alongside Lady Elaine. The knight walked to the gate, opening it. Our footman will take you to them. I would ask that you remove the circlets disguising your appearance, alongside Lady Elaine. What a delight, Argrave said with a smile, feeling like he dodged a bullet. You heard him. Circlets off, company, Argrave directed, doing so as he spoke. After a neat bow the footman led them through the garden, past the hedge maze, and through the door. They were greeted by a fanciful great room with 2 parallel winding stairways leading to a 2nd floor. Here, at least, there was some respite from the constant dreary black present in most of Just. The inside was mostly marble and dark wood, tastefully decorated with silver at points. After some turns, Argrave and his companions were led to a room guarded by 2 knights. The footman wordlessly opened the door and gestured inside, where Argrave entered. A small dining room awaited them. Barring the attending servants, there were 2 people present. Rivian sat at the head of the table opposite the entryway, while Elaine sat at the seat closest to his left. See? Spoke Rivian, mouth still full of food. He chewed and wiped his face with a napkin, swallowing before saying to his sister, I told you. Elaine was a little shocked to see him, and Argrave relished in that fact. He walked towards them, arms outstretched. Speak of the devil and he shall appear, Argrave said, staring at Elaine the whole while. Though perhaps that idiom is not popular in this place. Hello, Rivian. We have not met before, but I know you quite well. Behind, Anneliese and Guilliman tried to enter but were stopped by the knights. The guards should wait outside, he heard the knights argue. Argrave turned on his heel. Guards, these 2 are my companions. Let them in, Rivian said decisively, and shut the doors. The 2 elves entered the room, and the doors were shut behind them. Argrave turned back. Very kind of you to welcome me into your home on such short notice. Business is scarcely kind, Rivian said, planting his fork down and taking another bite of food. He chewed, staring at Argrave. He was quite a well-built man, and that made the finely made red clothes he wore appear much grander than they were. He seemed to be around his mid-30s, and he had a pair of bright green eyes that made his gaze piercing. Once Rivian swallowed, he pointed to a chair beside him. Have a seat. Your companions, too. He set the fork down for a moment, resting his elbows on the table and clasping his hands together. "I understand you wanted to have a conversation with me?" "Yes," Argrave nodded, making a show of walking slowly to the chair. "And who is this but Elaine?" he commented. "How might you know Rivian?" Argrave pulled back the chair closest to Rivian, opposite Elaine, and sat down. Anneliese and Guillermin sat to his right. "He's my brother," she said, face taut. "Your brother? Imagine that," Argrave said sarcastically. "It's such a small world." Rivian was faintly amused by his theatrics, just as Argrave had been aiming for. He took his elbows off the table and grabbed the fork once again, pointing at Argrave with it. "Would you like some pork or ostrich egg? My chef is quite exemplary." "No thank you," Argrave shook his head. "I've eaten." "I have to apologize for interrupting a lovely breakfast between siblings for talk of business, but I think this might interest you." "Certainly, but I have to ask. How is it you came to know of me?" Rivian inquired, taking another bite of food. "Our mutual winged friend," Argrave said with a small smile, referring to who Rivian knew as the Bat. In most of Heroes of Berenda, the Bat was an enigmatic figure whose agents were central in many side quests. But Argrave knew who it was. Princess Ilnor, a master strategist and schemer. Even blind, she sees more in Vaska than all, or so some would say. Of all the Vaskas, Ilnor was the most reasonable and measured. On the flip side, she was the most deceptive, and capable of more cruelty than all of them. Hers was a dispassionate and pragmatic cruelty, derived not from sadism but from benefits. She worked only for herself. As Argrave recalled, she had been one of the more popular romantic options. Many people like the idea of fixing a flawed person and winning affection from callousness. Her story was quite sad, Argrave had to admit, but then most of the Vaskas' lives were misery. Argrave did not dislike her especially, but he was not over-fond of the idea of working with her. Considering her influence, it seemed an inevitability. Argrave glanced at Anneliese. "Well, with Anneliese here, I'm sure I won't be too badly screwed by her. Even if she's not as good at scheming as Ilnor, Anneliese's smart enough to stop me from getting swept into the fire." Anneliese returned Argrave's look, confused. Argrave shook his head dismissively, smiling as though to tell her it was nothing. "As I thought." "You see?" Rivian pointed to Elaine, drawing Argrave from his thoughts. "Well, if it's that." Rivian looked at the attendants still in the room and gestured towards the door with his head. They all bowed at once and made for the door quietly, filing out one by one. Argrave waited quietly. Once the door shut, Rivian said, "This room is warded. You may speak freely without fear of being overheard." "I warded it, in fact," Elaine interjected. "How reliable, Elaine." "What a power duo." Argrave clapped his hands together. "To business. Firstly, I need you to get in contact with the diamond smugglers that come here. I know they don't work with you, but you can swing it, I hope." Rivian briefly looked to Argrave's elven companions. "The snow elves are skittish, especially after the failed invasion. If we contact them unexpectedly, they're expecting something from me." "Elaine, I'm sure you know of what I speak." "I do." "Castro sent the shipment," she confirmed. "Excellent, excellent." Argrave nodded. "We'll have to discuss things further later." "All right." "My commission, then," Rivian said, placing his elbows on the table and leaning in. "Hold for a minute." Argrave raised one finger up. "There's another matter, so let's make this a bundle deal." "Your crew?" "The Riveters," Argrave said unconfidently, and seeing Rivian did not react, assumed he said it right. "I'm going to be moving a lot of very valuable things around. Doubtless word has already reached you about the innumerable books I hauled from the Order's libraries." Rivian put his hands out. "I ordered my men not to touch your things. If you're related to the Bat in any manner, I won't get involved. I've learned much from Mother's mistakes regarding that person. Much of my success can be attributed to him." "Well, that's just it," Argrave continued. "Your little crew is the largest in town, and considering the valuable things I'm moving about, protection would be nice. I'd like you to watch the inn I'm staying at. Make sure no undesirables set foot in there. In general, I'd like it if you could make sure no one bothers me as I attend to my business in Just. It would be very much appreciated." Rivian tilted his head, expression stoic. "And if you placed some value on that appreciation?" Argrave rummaged through his pocket and pulled out 5 pink coins. He slid them over to Rivian, then spread his hands out. "Is that sufficient?" "How long will you be staying in Just?" Rivian eyed the coins. "Hopefully no more than 3 weeks," Argrave responded quickly, anticipating the question. Rivian reached his hand out across the table and placed a single digit on each coin. 5 now, 5 more in 3 weeks, with the possibility of extension should your business be unfinished. "Come now," Argrave began. "Your merry band is likely the most influential in Just. If you put the word out that the very tall, very skinny man with black hair is off limits, everyone is going to fall in line without a word. My offer is reasonable." "You're high profile." Rivian shook his head. "The invasion at Maytooth, rumor is spreading you stopped it. The Duke is calling you the hero of Montesai. There might be unexpected variables to deal with." "Is he now?" Argrave confirmed. He started gritting his teeth after Rivian nodded in confirmation. "I told Nicoletta I wanted no credit, nothing." "What is she thinking? Or is it Duke Enrico?" "Fine," Argrave agreed hastily, both fatigued from lack of sleep and bothered by the news Rivian shared. He stood, offering his hand. 5 more in 3 weeks. I suppose keeping me intact long enough to pay will give you an incentive to offer good protection. Rivian took his hand, green eyes veritably glittering. You'll be safe, I assure you. It's my business. I'll contact the Vyrdemon. Shouldn't take long if they're waiting. I certainly hope so. Argrave nodded. Now, Elaine, let's work out those illusion spellbooks for the Vyrdemon, shall we? Elaine stood, her expression somewhat icy. Yes, let's. So, any thoughts? Argrave asked Anneliese and Guilliman as the iron gate of Rivian's estate shut behind them. Elaine had decided to go ahead to the tower to get the shipment ready, and Argrave intended to join her in short order. Probably prudent. What few men I saw in his gang seemed competent enough. Well equipped, at the least, Guilliman noted as they walked away from the fence. I believe he was being genuine, Anneliese commented. As for the other, Elaine, I could tell she was very bothered by the matter. You think? Argrave turned. In what way? Her pride was hit. She felt made light of, slighted, mocked. I thought that may have been what you were aiming for. What with the jokes? If not, that was what you achieved. Argrave bit his lips. Some people. No sense of humor. He looked at Anneliese. Do you think she'll do something? She thought. Elaine also seemed bothered her brother did not defend her in the slightest. I believe. Granted, I did not see much of her. Certainly not enough to say with certainty. But she may not make things easy for us. If we're to be working with her, it might cause problems. With a sigh, Argrave stopped in the road. The other two stopped shortly ahead, then walked back to rejoin Argrave. Maybe we should just kill the old bag. Seeing Anneliese and Guilliman shift uneasily at the prospect, Argrave quickly added, I'm only joking. But something will have to be done. From my observations alone? Anneliese asked uncertainly. Alone? Argrave repeated. Your observations are worth a great deal alone. Argrave looked up at the distant order tower. I guess I have to be more considerate of people with prickly prides and enormous egos, Argrave muttered, lost in thought. Let's go back to the inn before we meet her. I have an idea that may benefit everyone. Chapter 63, Friends in the Business. Argrave walked into the just branch of the Order of the Grey Owl, adjusting the strap of the satchel bag off his neck. He looked behind his shoulder briefly. Anneliese and Guilliman waited at the entrance, unable to enter as they both lacked a badge. It reminded him of a pair of parents watching their kid to go to kindergarten, and Argrave briefly chuckled. His mirth very quickly died when he saw Elaine standing just before the central spire elevator, staring at him. Argrave figured by and large green was a warm color, but her eyes of that color were quite cold, or perhaps what Anneliese had told him was already shading his world in a different light. Do you find it funny to keep me waiting? Elaine asked when Argrave came closer, immediately dispelling any doubt he had. My apologies, Argrave said sincerely, coming to stand before her. She looked up at him boldly. There was something that I needed to get before this. I should have informed you. Evidently the sincerity had no holes in it, for Elaine could only stare back for a few seconds before nodding. And my proposition earlier, I can assume your visit to my brother is your answer to that? A resounding no. I can see why you might think that, Argrave nodded. But I was telling the truth back then. I don't have the books. She kept her gaze locked on Argrave for a few moments, and then turned away. You were smart to go to my brother. He's the best you can ask for in town. I hope things go well for you. It sounded a conciliatory statement, but Argrave trusted in Anneliese's instincts and decided to continue with his plan, beginning. There is another thing we might discuss after we take these books to the Vyrdemon, though. Something far more worth both our time than books, I think. Argrave pointed a finger. And you know what they say, time is money. Do they now? She turned her gaze back to him. Argrave spread his hands out. There's a reason I wanted someone watching my back here. Some things I've got. Let's just say they're not light burdens. He tapped the satchel on his waist. But we'll talk more about that someplace where everyone isn't staring at us. Provided you are amenable to that, Miss Elaine, Argrave finished suavely, dipping his head. She pursed her lips. We'll see what happens, she said vaguely. They're bringing the illusion spellbooks down. Shouldn't be much longer. I guess you would have been waiting after all. All's well that ends well, he said brightly, trying to focus on the positives. I suppose so, Elaine agreed, turning around. Argrave raised a brow, then shook his head. It's a start, I suppose. Are you sure that Rivian will have things ready for us? Argrave questioned, walking through the iron fence to Rivian's estate for the second time today. With Elaine beside him, he did not need to wait to be seen by Rivian. One small fortune. My brother is remarkably efficient, Elaine said simply. At the very least, considering he is the person who these books need to go through, it would be best to move them to this location. Guilliman stepped forward just behind them, carrying the large box of books as though it did not weigh as much as himself. Two of Elaine's men moved behind him, at a loss as to what to do considering Guilliman carried the cargo alone. Why do you travel with elves? Elaine inquired, the first question she'd asked during their entire walk. Moreover, elves recently responsible for an attack on Mateth. It's nice having people the same height as you. Makes you feel like you're normal, Argrave said, then laughed. Only joking. Why does anyone gain friends? It's the way things worked out. As you can see, both are quite reliable. Friends, Elaine said somewhat disdainfully. They aren't being paid? Anneliese isn't. He used to be. Argrave pointed to Gilliman. Now he's my indentured servant. Elaine looked at him for a moment, and Argrave leaned down and whispered, polite term for slave. She snorted and turned away while shaking her head, but Argrave didn't miss the smile. Seems like I'm winning her over, if only just. Unless that's a smile of derision. Always a possibility. Rivian opened the door and walked out, then noticed the oncoming cargo and stepped aside. Going out? Inquired Argrave, stepping off to the side as Rivian had done to allow Gilliman to pass. No. I know my sister. She's impatient. She'd want to do this right away, Rivian said, watching Gilliman walk past. Come now. Impatient. The nicer word is prompt, Argrave defended light-heartedly. She said only nice things about you. I'm sure you can manage the same. Is that right? Rivian said, glancing at Elaine. Good to know, I suppose. Rivian did not dwell on the subject long. My men will lead yours to where I'll hold the stuff. I've reached out to the crew I know that works with the Vyrdell, mentioning what you had, your name, things like that. Should work, provided they're actually expecting you. Argrave stepped inside Rivian's estate alongside Elaine. And I assume you've already got people watching out for me? Yes, Rivian nodded, stepping inside and shutting the doors to the estate behind him as Anneliese entered last. Word is out that you're Riveter's property. That includes the stuff you have in the place you're staying. That inn. Nice place. You chose well. Rivian stepped into the great room, continuing. Any people spying, prying, or otherwise scrying will give up their chase or end things with a bolt to the head. And if we can't manage to do that, we can at least warn you who's got their eyes on you. Premium services, I'd say. Better be, with what you're charging, Argrave said derisively. Well, my charging is done for now, unless you have more business with me, Rivian said. Not with you. The other red-headed one, though. I do. Argrave pointed to Elaine, who seemed surprised that Argrave had been serious. Can we use that same room as last time for a discussion? Business with my sister? Rivian smiled incredulously as though it was amusing. Who am I to stop you from going into any room in the house? Your name is on the deed. Branch Manager Elaine. Right then. Shall we? Argrave asked. I promise this'll be worth your time. Elaine furrowed her brows for a moment. After a time, she hesitantly nodded. Hold on. Rivian raised a finger. I have a question for you, Argrave. So you do? Argrave nodded. Will you ask this question, or just hold on to it? Rivian snorted. The bat. Have you spoken to him? Argrave nodded. Indeed I have. Care to share anything? Might be I can waive this fee altogether, Rivian suggested. Well. Argrave paused. He didn't want to attract Princess Eleanor's attention quite yet. Spreading details about her would be a surefire way to do so. Argrave leaned in close as though he was telling a big secret and whispered, Bat is not a real name. I'm sure this comes as an immense shock, but it's actually an alias. Elaine laughed a little while Rivian stared with a smile on his face. I see. I guess he must choose his agents right, because no one I've spoken to cares to divulge any information on who the bat is. All I can surmise is that they have a lot of money and they're very smart. Wealthy, smart. That sounds like you're talking about me. Argrave pointed to himself. Add handsome, you've got a dead ringer. Rivian shook his head amusedly as he sized up Argrave's spindly limbs. Handsome, even if there's a sterling face on skin and bones, doesn't change the big picture. Few women like someone they can take in a fist fight. He grinned somewhat provocatively, but Argrave wasn't bothered. When Argrave didn't rise to the bait, Rivian scratched his chin and turned, waving them away. Well, banter aside, I have nothing else. He's all yours, sis. So, what is it you wished to speak to me about? Elaine asked, gaze sometimes drifting to the satchel bag he held. Straight to business, Argrave said, shutting the door behind Anneliese. He turned to the dining table, which had been emptied. I like it. Argrave grabbed the strap of his satchel bag and picked it up, laying it out across the table. He opened its flap and pulled free his lockbox, setting it on the table. The amaranthine heart was visible, and Argrave pushed it back into the bag self-consciously. He retrieved the key for the lockbox from his breast pocket, briefly brushing against the bronze hand mirror, and opened the box. The metal lid of the lockbox opened, revealing glimmering jewels, jewelry, and myriad shimmering pink coins. Take a look at this, Argrave said, gesturing towards the box. Ignore the rose gold magic coins. That's not what this is about. Even Elaine, who lived in a grand estate like this, showed considerable shock at seeing Argrave have such a staggering quantity of money. Argrave smiled. He had been hoping for this reaction. By visiting her brother, Argrave had demonstrated that he did not trust Elaine. The action also wounded her pride. By showing her something that was ostensibly secret, Argrave's money, he showed that he did trust her. Argrave knew a simple principle. By showing trust in someone, it is easier to receive it from them in return. Elaine was the manager of the Just branch of the Order of the Grey Owl. Having a good relationship with her would make his activities in Just go smoothly, and would likely have benefits in the future, as well. Argrave took no risk by showing this one card in his hand. Elaine was a bit truthless, but she respected her brother's business partners. Look at these, Argrave continued on, fishing a necklace out of the lockbox. Look at this lovely emerald pendant. It might go well with your nice green eyes. He held it up, and she frowned. "Don't get angry. I'm not here to sell you jewelry. Each and every one of these lovely pieces is enchanted." He dropped the necklace and it clattered against the rest. "So?" She pressed. "They're stolen, and you want me to sell them?" She shook her head. "You'd be better off bringing this to my brother." "No. They aren't." Argrave trailed off. "I guess they are stolen." He turned to Anneliese, musing. "We took them from a grave, technically, but their civilization died thousands of years ago, so it should be fine, no?" He bit his lip. "No, I suppose not. I guess I'm a bad person." "Talk sense for a minute," Elaine said. "You took these from a grave?" "An elven tomb," Argrave corrected, moving his finger from Anneliese to Elaine. "Each and every piece of enchanted jewelry in here was made with lost methods. Might be some of them are useless. Might be some of them are invaluable. That's what I need your help with." "My help?" She shook her head. "How am I to believe you about their origins?" Argrave grabbed the crown from the lockbox. "I know this one's effect. It enhances your physical strength and stamina. Try it on." She hesitantly took the crown from Argrave's hand. It was almost too large for her head, and it sunk down a fair bit before her bountiful red hair caught it. "I feel nothing." "Try jumping, or running," Argrave suggested. She frowned at Argrave, but seeing him remain serious, she jumped. She got a great distance off the ground and panicked. After waving her arms about, she landed ungracefully. The crown fell off her head as she struggled to keep her balance. The crown rolled away, and Argrave stepped forward, grabbing it elegantly. "That's a genuine artifact," she said, staring at it. "Physical enhancements caused by enchantment." Sarah lost heart. "And it was pulled from that tomb?" "Correct." Argrave nodded. Seeing her amazed stare at the crown remain unbroken, Argrave added, "I have some plans for this one. It's these others I want to entrust to you. When all is said and done, perhaps we can discuss selling some of these to you." Elaine's gaze turned back to stare up at his face, and she nodded. "As I recall, you mentioned you warded this room." Argrave waved his hands about. "I need someone well acquainted with enchantments to discern what each piece of jewelry does. I can offer a significant price," Argrave added, rummaging through jewels and pink coins all but overflowing from the lockbox. "Well." Elaine stepped forward, picking up a piece of jewelry. She held it up in the air, studying it. "To be frank, this is beyond my expertise. It's one thing for me to know enchantments that the Order has documented and that exist, but one would need certain specialists to decipher ancient enchantments, and he would know those specialists better than Elaine of Vyrbell, manager of the Just branch of the Order of the Grey Owl." Argrave smiled. "I guess you do know a thing or two," she admitted, lowering the jewelry and placing it back in the lockbox. "Let's talk a service fee." At those words, Argrave nodded with a faint smile. He might be able to get it cheaper if he skipped by Elaine and went directly to the people she'd reach out to. But oftentimes knowing the right people was more important than getting the best prices. Always nice to have friends in high places. "I think this is the start of a beautiful friendship built on half-truths and money." Chapter 64, Sowing Seeds. In the days to come, Guilliman was strongly reminded of back when he and Argrave had been planning for the assault on the Druids' camp. Argrave led them through the city as adroitly as one who lived there, heading to obscure shops and famous shops in equal measure and setting various things in motion. They were unbothered by any, though Guilliman was acutely aware of the people watching them. At times, they would be accosted by irate people suspicious that they were Vyrdemon, but when Argrave removed his circlet of disguise and revealed his non-elven features, that was typically enough to send them away. There was an undeniable tension in the city. Guilliman mostly harvested his blood from places like taverns, where the people within would be less cautious of him and far easier to prey upon. While there, he often witnessed people come to blows in debates regarding the cause of the snakes or the lions. Common opinion seemed to favor the rebels. Furthermore, the word of an invasion against Mateth had set people against the Vyrdemon, stoking tempers more yet. Much of Guilliman's time was occupied with the repair of his armor, as the smiths needed to be directed in Vyrdemon styles. Guilliman made use of the days spent on this endeavor to make the ebonice arrows from the daggers as Argrave had suggested. Guilliman used all but 5 daggers and chiseled out 30 ebonice arrowheads. It would be more than sufficient for their needs for a long while, he suspected. The rest of Guilliman's time dealt with accompanying Argrave on his spendthrift shopping journeys. Guilliman had been unsure that Argrave's price estimates were accurate, for most of the things he intended to purchase could be considered heirlooms in aristocratic houses. Most of the time, Argrave managed to get them far cheaper than he initially predicted. Much of it was due to Argrave's bartering prowess. The majority of what Argrave ordered would take some time to finish, and so once all of the requests were put in and down payments were made, their party retired to the inn and devoted their time to study. Argrave often drank the black liquid magic and talked about repaying his magic debt quickly. It was idyllic compared to their usual activities, and Argrave commented on that fact often. They were only disturbed on the 7th day of their stay. "What are you doing?" asked Guilliman, who just re-entered into the inn's room. He wore plain brown clothes with long sleeves. His frame was large and the clothes stuck tight, giving the impression he wore something too small. "What are you wearing?" Argrave stood beside a table, where an empty pot and a potted plant rested beside each other. The potted plant was, in actuality, a strange multicolored mushroom sprouting about a foot high. Argrave wore an apron and held a small shovel, where he lowered dirt into the empty pot. Anneliese watched as though the ordeal was fascinating. "Some light gardening," joked Argrave. He looked into the empty pot. "I suspect this much should be enough." He retrieved a stone shaped like a real heart and lowered it into the pot. "Now, let's put the amaranthine heart into there. And next, this plant." "What was it you called this?" Anneliese pointed to the plant. "Hydra's canopy." Argrave pulled out the mushroom and lowered it into the other pot, whereupon he promptly buried it in dirt. "It's well known for being ridiculously resilient. You cut off the mushroom's cap, it's grown back by the end of the day and then some. So, because of its resilience, the amaranthine heart can extract more liquid magic from it before the plant dies. It has more life to convert to magic." "Sure," Argrave said, piling dirt on. "There are plants we might choose that are more cost-efficient, but this little mushroom offers the most yield in the shortest amount of time. After around 3 days, we get another Hydra's canopy, and we extract all the magic the hearts produced." Argrave mused about the many graphs people had made to calculate which plants were most efficient, cost-wise, for the best gold-to-magic ratio. Most everyone in the Heroes of Berenda community agreed that, after the player had collected enough money, it was best to spend more for the Hydra's canopy. "You're certain this will work?" Anneliese questioned as Argrave put the last bit of dirt over the mushroom's stalk. "Sure," said Argrave. "I mean, it should work. I've never seen it done, and I don't know if I'm doing it right. But ostensibly, this is all we need to do." In Heroes of Berenda, it had been as simple as opening your inventory and combining the items within it. Argrave recalled the item descriptions, and this was what they described. If there was something he was missing, he couldn't be certain, but he was relatively confident. Argrave removed his apron, folding it neatly and placing it on the table. I know. I can see the questions on your head. How does he know these things? But you forfeited your right to ask the question." Argrave cleaned off the shovel with the apron. "Having any change of heart?" "My offer still stands. You've done a lot for me, both of you, so if you have something to ask." "Hold," Gulliman said, and Argrave turned towards him curiously. Then, Argrave heard it too, a set of footsteps moving up the stairs of the inn. He heard them walk across the hall, and then a knock came to their door. Gulliman held up one finger to symbolize one person and waited for Argrave's direction. Argrave nodded and gestured towards the door. Gulliman moved to open it. A broad-shouldered man wearing leather armor waited, face covered by a mask. "You're one of Rivian's men," Gulliman said at once. "I've seen you watching." I am," he said, staring up at Gulliman cautiously. "Saved me the trouble of explaining myself, it seems." "What is it?" Argrave inquired, moving up. "Some trouble?" "Depends." Rivian said. "Little Lord Stain came to him, said he had some urgent news for you. Considering your history, Rivian thought it'd be prudent to run it by you." Argrave pursed his lips. "I'd like to see Stain." At once, the man nodded, then walked away from the door. "So this is where you're staying," said Stain idly, glancing around their room. Argrave could tell he was a bit taken aback by the sheer quantity of books. They had turned the place into a mini library in the days that they'd been here. His gaze locked on the potted mushroom, expression perplexed. Rivian's man that had been here earlier pushed Stain inside, and then came to stand in the corner. "Rivian told me I should offer to stay, make sure nothing gets out of hand." "Offer declined," Argrave said simply. "Be off, would you?" The man nodded, unoffended by Argrave's brusqueness. He left and shut the door quickly. Argrave held out his hand and cast the new wide-range C-rank warding spell he'd learned, and at once, the 4 of them were shrouded in a ward from which no sound could leak. Stain's eyes darted around uneasily. He fixed his brown hair, and then stood nervously with his hands impolitely held in front of him. "I'm sorry for contacting you ahead of our date, but there was something I heard that my intuition said you might be interested in." Argrave grabbed a chair and pulled it away from the table in the center of the room, sitting down in front of Stain. When sitting, his gaze was level with Stain's. "Let's hear it." "Right." Stain cleared his throat. Well, firstly, I figured out what you wanted me to figure out. My brother is going to be following his liege lord, the Duke of Elbrail, into war. He'll be taking the side of the snakes, cretin that he, excuse me." Stain cut himself off, clearly afraid to share his opinion. Argrave took a deep breath and sighed. "I see," he said, keeping his thoughts hidden in front of Stain. "You have proof of this?" "Oh. I didn't. It's still at my place in the system." "I can." He stepped towards the door quickly. "Get it later. For now, let's finish our talk." Argrave crossed one leg over the other. "Anything else regarding the war you can mention? For example, the way of things?" "No. Even the letter I did manage to get was vague, but I confirmed that Elbrail intends to support Vaska. Apparently, the Crown Prince is coming to officiate things, make some promises concrete. Typical noble backpatting, pampers and perfumes, the like." Argrave frowned. "He isn't coming here, I hope?" "No." Stain shook his head quickly. "The prince is going straight to Elbrail, where he'll be hosted by Duke Moroch and his wife." "I see." Argrave leaned back in the chair, his brain spinning. The biggest change I've caused is House Montesi maintaining its control over Mateth and its other territories. It's reasonable to assume that this is the biggest cause for this happening. I've got some ideas, but I need to talk this out with Anneliese. I'm sure she can help me make sense of this, help me make a course of action. Now, about that thing that was urgent, Stain spoke, breaking the silence. Oh. Argrave lifted his head, drawn from his thoughts. Go ahead, tell me. Apparently, the young Lord Elias of Parban is coming to Jast. Stain spoke slowly. My brother plans to host a welcoming banquet for him, and he sent out a messenger to intercept him with an invitation. Considering who the Duke's siding with, I thought this was a pretty big thing if Elias comes right into my brother's seat of power. There might be some things that happen. House arrest at best, a slaughter at worst, though I doubt he'll be killed. Elias has more value alive, I think. Argrave furrowed his brows. Him again? He muttered. Elias' escort can't be small, considering it's wartime. I'm not sure about all that. Stain shook his head. From what I heard from the Count, he doesn't think Elias will even come to the banquet. I think there might be something else in the works, ambush on the roads, or maybe even the streets. A card like that? It's got value. Knowing my brother, he'd like to keep Elias as a guest for a long while. Margrave Reinhardt knows his son would be a prime target. I don't think. Argrave paused before he got further into his thought process. All right. It was good of you to bring this to me. Absolutely, Stain said enthusiastically. I'll get those letters you wanted right away. No problem at all. You need anything else, don't hesitate. You know where I am, I think, and if not, you can find me. Stain trailed off nervously. There is something else. You've done well bringing me this, but I need you to do something more. Argrave leaned in. Find Elias. And do what? Stain asked, clearly taken aback. Tell him that Argrave is looking for him. Tell him that we should speak before he enters Jast. Stain nodded. Is that your name? Yes and no, Argrave said. There was some truth to that, strangely enough. Be off, then, and retrieve those letters. Return shortly. We'll still be here. Chapter 65, A Brief Foray. Argrave tipped back the large glass bottle and drained it to the last of the black liquid mana. His gaze stayed locked on the ceiling of the inn as it fell into his mouth. He winced at the familiar taste, twisting his lips about as though to dispel the flavor from his tongue. He felt its magic surge within him, replenishing his diminished supply. Expending one's magic was one of the few ways to increase its size. By channeling his magic power to pay off Erlebnir debt caused by the blessing of supersession, Argrave had an efficient method to drain his magic. The recovery period was shortened by the black liquid magic created by the amaranthine heart. Altogether, his personal reserve of magic had increased very quickly relative to most other mages. That alone made the amaranthine heart a worthy item to obtain. Right. My debt is nearly paid off. Argrave held the bottle in his hand for a moment, and then set it on the floor. Debt? Anneliese inquired. She sat beside Gilliman, both waiting for him to speak. Every bit of magic I take from Erlebnir I have to pay back. It's the same ability his emissaries possess. Argrave wrapped his gloved hands together. Right. To the point. Today we're going to take a brief foray from town as we wait for events to progress. I've asked Rivian to keep an eye out for Elias, too, so we can ostensibly only wait for results from either him or Stain. Gilliman nodded. Why are we leaving Jast? The elven vampire was still without armor and most of his weapons. Argrave had purchased a simple broadsword for him to use temporarily, and it rested on the table before him. Argrave leaned back into his chair, crossing his arms. We need to get that spellbook I mentioned in the past. It's a marvel made by the Order of the Rose. The spell is called Electric Eel. It's C rank. For Anneliese it'll be largely useless, but I suspect I will be using it well into A rank. What makes it so exceptional? Inquired Anneliese. It's weak, Argrave began, standing from his chair and stepping about their dormitory. It's barely weaker than the D rank, Writhing Lightning, and it has no area of effect unlike that spell. It's slower than most lightning spells. Despite that, two variables make it of utmost importance. Argrave raised a finger as he listed the two off. It's persistent, and it's controllable. Argrave roamed about the dormitory as he continued to explain. Once the spell has been cast, it continues to exist for about an hour, or until it strikes something. Naturally, one can have it hover about their head doing nothing but simply existing. Then, when the time comes, one can use it as they please. Finished explaining, Argrave grabbed the back of his chair and leaned in. As I said, the spell is weak. It's slow, compared to most lightning magic, at least. But when 1,000 of these things strike at once, even a dragon is going to take mortal damage. A wyvern might die outright. Argrave grinned. As I possess Erlebnir blessing, this spell is the perfect thing for an underdog like myself gunning for the biggest things in town. For beasts and monsters, it indeed sounds very effective, Anneliese conceded. But in battle against mages or armies, they would all dispel harmlessly against one C-rank ward, Anneliese posited. That's why I had Gilliman make Ebonice arrows. Argrave pointed to Gilliman. Ebonice is not especially effective against B-rank magic, and completely ineffective against A-rank magic, Glimmin advised. And that's why I'm continuing to learn blood magic. Most C-rank blood magic spells can break B-rank warding magic, and that trend is similar at the higher ranks. Once the ward is broken, the spells can slip past and deal tremendous damage. Electric Eel may be slow compared to most lightning spells, but they're still nigh unavoidable for your average human. Argrave turned around. In Mateth and Vaiden, I was weak. Once we leave here, will be a force to be reckoned with. Argrave led his horse up the grass hill ahead of him. Anneliese and Guilliman waited at the top. Though Anneliese had only ridden horses a quarter of the time that he had, she was already vastly better at it than he was. Such was her talent as one with the genius trait. Argrave suspected she would become a B-rank mage much sooner than he would, too. Strangely, he felt no envy. There was only a fierce desire to work harder. Once Argrave crested the top of the hill, he slowed his horse and it whinnied loudly. The 6 pigeons bound to him via pack leader swooped down, landing on his shoulder. One held a worm in its beak, and strangely enough, it did not disgust Argrave. I'm getting too used to bird mannerisms, muttered Argrave. Anneliese did not hear him, but Guilliman replied, release them, then. He adjusted his bow. It was strung, and he wore it on his back as though the string were a strap. His quiver dangled from his side. It held only iron arrows, for they had no need of ebonice. Not feasible, dismissed Argrave. Though, if I ever try to fly off a tall building, please stop me. Don't joke about that, Anneliese said angrily. Argrave was taken aback by her sharp gaze. Okay, yeah, he agreed, nodding awkwardly. Her amber eyes turned away. I believe this is the place you spoke of, Guilliman pointed, ignorant or uncaring of their exchange. Following Guilliman's finger, Argrave's gaze found its way down a small overgrown gorge. A tiny stream moved down into it, mostly obscured by tall blades of grass barely graying in light of winter's beginning. At the very end, Argrave faintly made out a carved stone structure. Indeed, this is it, Argrave agreed, moving his horse forward slightly. It seemed uncomfortable at the prospect of going deeper, perhaps because it could sense what lay behind those walls, or perhaps simply because the entrance to the gorge was too steep. Thorngorge Citadel. We should tie up the horses, Guilliman contributed, alighting from his mount. He grabbed it by the reins and looked about for a place to tie it up. Most of the area around them was plains without a single tree in sight. In the distance, one could see the gargantuan towers of Just standing against the sky, casting great shadows across the plains. Beyond it, Argrave could faintly make out a single white tower ascending out of the middle of the ringfoot. Argrave touched Anneliese's shoulder. Hey, see that? That white tower? She turned, looking out across the landscape. Slowly, she nodded. I used to own that. Foam Spire, it's called. Sold it for all those rose gold magic coins. Argrave kept his eyes on the white tower. In the distance, it looked small, but it probably towered 50 feet in the air. It was built atop a sea arch. Arches form on leading-edge shorelines. This is simplifying things a great deal, but Argrave tried to create the image with his hands. The waves hit a piece of land jutting out into the water and refract, and gradually, the center wears out, creating an arch in the sea. Over time, the whole thing falls into the ocean. Argrave snapped, but no sound came out because he was wearing gloves. That's why I sold it. In a few months, it's going to fall into the ocean. A good sale, all things considered, Anneliese commented. I might have got more if I sold it elsewhere, but we wouldn't have any money now. Someone had the misfortune to purchase it from me. Argrave nodded, then said grimly, let's hope whoever purchased it isn't planning to stay there anytime soon. Eventually, their party found a fairly decent place to tie up the horses so that the animals would not be disturbed by either people or the elements. They descended down into the gorge, mindful not to trip over the graying winter grass at their feet. Before we enter? Argrave called out as they grew near the stone door. Some things to keep in mind. There are some creatures within that don't have arms, they're just heads, and they're immobile. It may be tempting to kill them, but don't. You'll attract the attention of some rather nasty things called Dairais. They're spiritual beings, meaning they attack the soul. Only magic affects them. Guilliman turned round, a deep frown disturbing his face. As for the other ones, if they grab your weapon, Guilliman, don't try and pull it free. Just drop it. This probably won't happen to you as you're an experienced warrior, but just in case. Mostly, I think you'll be using your bow. Argrave looked about. Anneliese, you should use the C-rank spell, Ice Spear. It should kill most things within instantly. I will do the same. It's why I learned that spell. You see, always aim for the eyes. They're very big and very vulnerable. What invade's name is in this place? Questioned Guilliman. You did not seem worried that I could not be wearing my armor, but the things you describe sound dangerous. What are they? Abominations. There's no better way to put it. Argrave stepped past and approached the stone door. The Order of the Rose fell because their members practiced necromancy without discretion. They're the largest reason necromancy is illegal in the Order of the Grey Owl. Argrave rapped his knuckles on the stone door. Beyond these doors, we'll find necromantic nightmares and horrors sculpted of flesh. This is what you meant by a brief foray. Anneliese stepped forward, pulling her long white hair aside and placing her ear to the stone door. "You showed more fear at the Cavern of the Lily's death. Am I to take it this place is less dangerous?" "Largely speaking. These things are quite impotent. Strange anatomies are not conducive to effective displays of strength." Argrave watched Anneliese as she tried to hear beyond the stone without much success. "Just have to watch the ceilings. Make sure the other denizens don't sneak up on us. That's what Guilliman is for." Anneliese lifted her head from the side of the door and looked at Guilliman. She quickly reached back and bound her hair in a simple braid. Argrave was impressed at her speed. In perhaps 10 seconds, the large mass of white hair descending to her knees was tied back in a ponytail. "Perhaps next time we may choose a place that is not a dark, dank underground cavern. I am well tired of crouching through narrow places and banging my knees against rocks," she said with little enthusiasm. Argrave considered her statement, hand on his chin. "That's unfortunate. Long term, I believe there's to be quite a lot of this." Argrave looked to the door, head tilted. "On the bright side, I don't think this place is cramped. There's plenty of room, plenty of space for things to hide, too." Guilliman drew his broadsword, the steel rattling as it came free of its scabbard. He pointed towards the door. "Anything else you wish to share?" "Just follow my directions, I suppose." "As ever, you'll take the front." "Right," Guilliman muttered. "As ever." He walked to the door. It was circular and simple. The years had cracked it, though not enough to let any light through. Guilliman placed his hand on its side and pushed. It creaked, grinding against the floor, and then pushed open slowly, grating horribly. Once it was open, Guilliman stood there gazing inside. "Looks to be clear. It smells of blood, but it's wrong, rotten, debased, defiled by magic." His gaze slowly lifted up. Something dropped down, and Guilliman immediately thrust his sword up at it. Whatever was falling stopped, and blood started to drip down Guilliman's blade. A creature mostly still hidden in darkness narrowly stopped itself from being impaled, two of its many hands grasping the center of the blade. Guilliman stared up at it, and Argrave prepared a spell to dispatch it. It started to move, and Guilliman heeded Argrave's words, tossing both the creature and the blade away. Both tumbled, sliding, and then landed just where the sunlight fell into the ruin. The creature's body was only a head. This head could not be any smaller than Argrave's torso. It was bald and veins bulged from its forehead as though enraged. Its neck extended down and branched off into 8 arms. The arms lacked joints, its fingers had no knuckles, the forearm had no elbow. It was like a twisted mockery of a man and an octopus. Dazed, it took a moment to settle itself, and then it looked around. Argrave met its eyes. They were an absolute black with 2 golden rings for irises, as though someone had poured molten gold into dual abysses. Its nose and ears had been cut off. From the still bleeding orifices, childlike hands emerged and pulled at its eyelids, keeping those dread eyes exposed and bloodshot. Its mouth had been sewn shut, but its sharp teeth pierced its flesh and left wounds from which harsh, uneven breathing came. Anneliese took a step back, and Guilliman readied himself. The creature shifted about, dragging its arms against the ground. As it made to move, a spear of ice hurtled forth soundlessly, taking it in the eye. It slid back a few feet from the impact, slamming into a wall. Argrave stepped forward, hand still outstretched after casting the magic. "Scary bastard," Argrave commented, coming to a cautious stop. "There aren't too many of those in there, but those will be our main opponent. It's why we watch the ceilings in Thorngorge Citadel." Anneliese let out a sigh of relief, and Guilliman stepped forward and retrieved his blade, cleaning it of blood on his pants. He peered out into the hallway beyond. "No use standing around," Argrave said cheerily. "You first, Guilliman." As ever. Chapter 66, Thorngorge Citadel. Argrave's hand came alive with a spell matrix and a small ball of flame jumped up into the air above his head, illuminating the stone passage ahead. Thorngorge Citadel was distinct from the previous places they had explored. The tomb of metal guardians had been wide and spacious. The ruins hidden within the Cavern of the Lily's death had been meticulously carved, but the citadel was surpassingly simple in design. A straight cube-shaped hallway stretched ahead. Every so often, iron bars blocked the path. They had been broken, seemingly ripped apart, and the years had rusted them to uselessness. Some of the breaks left sharp points exposed. Argrave could see dried blood on the floor on and near the sharp parts. Evidently the creatures roaming the citadel had cut themselves on the exposed metal. Guilliman stepped forward past Argrave, advancing first as he had been directed. Argrave could see his head moving about, scanning each bit of the hallway before proceeding. When they came to the first set of iron bars, Anneliese paused and peered at where they met the walls. "These bars. They can't open, nor can they slide out of the way," she noted. "You called this place a citadel. Why are these bars like this?" Argrave had been expecting that she would ask some questions and had an answer prepared. "It's a mage's citadel. The Order of the Rose had mastery in earth elemental magic. This entire place was built with magic alone. Supposedly, they could build one of these citadels in a day provided they had enough capable spellcasters. Their mastery was great enough to manipulate even metal." "I see," she muttered, her curiosity sated somewhat. Guilliman took his bow off his back and took an arrow from his quiver. Argrave and Anneliese paused, and in the silence, The faint sound of choked breathing could be heard. "Be sure it's not just ahead," Argrave cautioned. "Like I said, we don't want to get the attention of the dire eyes." Glimmerman's white eyes fixed on Argrave briefly, and he knocked an arrow. "I am capable of remembering things you say. You seem to forget this often. I just don't want any." The boat wanged, and a black blur vanished into darkness. A rather unpleasant noise sounded out ahead, and Glimmerman walked forth. Argrave could only shake his head and follow along. When they finally reached what the arrow had hit, Argrave saw one of the 8-armed head creatures with an arrow sticking right out of its black eye. Its arms spasmed a few times, fingers clenching, and then it grew still. Glimmerman put his foot on its forehead and pulled the arrow out. Argrave stepped back so that none of its viscera would land on his shoes. Glimmerman cleaned the arrow and then proceeded onwards. The hallway began to slope down ahead of them, but Argrave's steps were confident. Glimmerman glanced back at him, brows furrowed. "What?" asked Argrave. Glimmerman shook his head, and then proceeded. The hallway leveled out again, and ahead of them finally opened up into a room. Glimmerman stopped Argrave with his arm, staring into the darkness beyond. "I see one of those heads that you mentioned," he said. Argrave pushed his arm away and replied, "Then you know what not to do." Glimmerman nodded, entering the room. Argrave entered after him. The light of his spell illuminated some stone bed frames. The mattresses within had rotted away to nothing. When the light of the spell fell upon a head on a spike, sound filled the room, and both Anneliese and Glimmerman jumped. The creature, a human-like head with a snout and a black nose, sounded like a Tasmanian devil with its rattling, dry growl interspersed with snorting. The sound echoed against the stone walls, filling the place with sound. Such a thing might have worried Argrave, but he knew most of the creatures in this place were deaf. The few that could hear were incapable of coming to the upper levels. Argrave retrieved a decaying and decrepit canvas blanket and draped it over the head, and the sound faded somewhat. He turned back to his 2 elven companions. "Noisy one, isn't it?" Argrave spoke loudly above the din, wiping his gloves clean of the dust on the blanket. "This first level has the soldiers' dormitories. The non-mages would sleep here. Rather kind of the order to place them at the entrance of the Citadel. No, first line of defense, first to die." Anneliese took uncertain steps forward, eyes locked on the head still growling. "Are you not uneasy?" Argrave was perplexed. "Why? Something amiss?" "You're eerily calm," Anneliese said. "These things." She trailed off. "Why do they not bother you?" Argrave frowned, turning his head back to the still screaming head. Anneliese wasn't wrong. These things probably should make him uneasy. That said, of every dungeon type in Heroes of Berenda, abandoned citadels constructed by the Order of the Rose were likely the most common. They were largely uniform in design, and the biggest risks were the traps, not the enemies. Moreover, the player could summon each and every one of the creatures within these walls if they studied necromancy. Fear comes from uncertainty. "The unknown," Argrave said slowly, speaking only as the answer came to him. He knew Thorngorge Citadel like the back of his hand. After all, Electric Eel was one of his favorite attack spells, and this was one of the easiest places to get it. He had seen these creatures 1,000 times before. Their unusual appearances did not bother him even if they were far more realistic than he was used to. "I know what lurks in here. We're more than capable of confronting anything within." "What's there to be fearful of?" Argrave concluded, thumping the screaming creature's forehead. Anneliese stared at it as it growled beneath the canvas. She blinked a few times, then took a deep breath, nodding. "Right. I envy that knowledge." Argrave snorted, and then made to proceed. Opposite the hallway they had entered from, another identical one sloped gently downward. It proceeded onward for a short bit, and then opened up into a curved hallway going left and right. Argrave knew from past experiences that these two paths formed a ring containing many other dormitories along the way. In the silence following their pause, Argrave heard a faint noise. After it repeated, he recognized it as a whisper. On the inner wall of the hallway, there was an empty space acting as a window into the portion beyond. Anneliese walked past him, leaning down and gazing into it. Argrave followed after her, staring at just as she did. The inside was hollow and descended for a long way down. One could see the other levels of the Citadel, each with an opening identical to the one they looked out of. The source of the whispers dominated most of their vision, though. Branches of bone extended upwards from the ground far below. At points, what looked like white roses bloomed. Argrave knew they were not. The white roses were humanoid faces. Each had been morphed into the shape of a rose, twisted and bent unnaturally like some terrifying modern art given life. Their black and gold eyes were beautiful and decidedly feminine, and each blink was exaggerated by large lashes. Their mouths would open at times and whisper haunting phrases that Argrave was well familiar with, calls for help, calls for death, questions of where and what they were. Even expecting this, Argrave could not help but shudder. He spotted movement in the corner of his eyes and noticed that Anneliese was shaking. He grabbed her shoulder, and she flinched slightly. "Take it easy. Those things can't move. They're one of the least dangerous things here." "Right, right." She nodded quickly as though trying to reassure herself. Argrave turned her away forcibly, leading her away from the inner wall. Glimmerman stared out beyond, expression passive as though he was unbothered. "She's been to war before. I doubt that it's the gore rattling her. There's something else at play. That, or I underestimated the psychological impact this place might have." Argrave reflected. He bit his lips, thinking, and quickly made a decision. "Alright, let's hurry this up, Guilliman. This way," he directed, placing Anneliese on the side opposite the inner wall and hurrying Guilliman along with a wave of his hand. Their progress was much faster than it had been before, but Guilliman still maintained a cautious pace, pausing only to dispatch some of the 8 armed creatures lurking on the walls or ceilings. The Tasmanian devil-like screams of the disembodied heads filled the halls, setting the mood tenser yet. They wound around the ring, heading to where Argrave knew the main stairwell would be. Fortunately, unlike in the ruins nested within the Lily Lurker's cavern, the stairs were not placed far from each other. The main stairwell descended all the way to the bottom, spiraling down steadily. Anneliese was quite reticent during this time, focused more on the path ahead of her than the things around her. Argrave could not deny he felt some worry, but he tried not to distract himself from the matter at hand. On the second-to-last floor, Argrave led them off the stairwell. Bits of the bone and flesh plant in the central room pierced the stone of this floor. Some rose faces exposed in the hallway. It was difficult to avoid their voices. Argrave made sure to proceed past them quickly, but sometimes they were directly above or beside the hallway, peering down and whispering. After a good deal of walking, they came to a room that had a wooden door, an oddity, considering most other places were simply empty doorways. Argrave stopped Guilliman. "This is the place, the commander's quarters. There's a great hulking creature within. It's rather unobservant, but it's quite powerful. If you shoot one of its legs, it should be largely immobilized and easily dispatched. Each leg is about yay big," Argrave demonstrated, creating a width about the size of a basketball. "I trust you can shoot that?" "If I couldn't, I might have to set the bow aside for the rest of my life," Guilliman said, weighing his weapon in his hand. "Does it move quickly?" "Not if you hit it. It's not very observant, so you can expect the first shot to be quite easy." Argrave put his hand on the door, preparing to push it open. Guilliman grabbed Argrave's wrist and pulled his hand away. "I go first." As ever, Argrave wasn't in the mood to laugh at what may well have been a joke, so he nodded and stepped aside. Anneliese, who had regained much of her composure, stared ahead as though refusing to look around. Guilliman knocked an arrow in his bow, holding it pointed at the ground as he pushed open the door steadily. The door pushed open slowly, the light of their spells peeking through the cracked opening. Something on the other side blocked its opening, and Guilliman held up a hand to stop them from moving any further. He moved one eye to the cracked door, looking about. Evidently he found nothing out of sorts and continued to push open the door. As the door opened, they could hear the sounds of clattering wood. Argrave could see debris being shifted about as Guilliman pushed. Even Argrave was slightly worried that the beast within the room would be drawn to the noise, but nothing shifted within the room. The majority of the room was covered in debris, splintered wood, chips of stone, or torn-apart books. It would make any significant movement impossible. Argrave could vaguely see their enemy in the corner of the room. What Argrave saw amounted to a hunk of flesh, but Guilliman saw more. He drew back his bowstring, taking aim into what Argrave saw only as darkness. A twang echoed out, followed by a near-wrenching howl. The beast shambled out from the darkness, and Argrave saw an arrow sticking from its leg. Argrave was prepared to cast another spell to be sure it fell, but once its injured leg met the ground, it immediately tumbled and fell, exposing its great bulk in their spell light. It crashed against the debris, sending splinters and chips of stone flying. Guilliman grabbed the door and shielded himself with it, but Argrave felt some heated pain from his cheek as a flying splinter struck him. Argrave ignored the pain and stepped back, examining the creature. Were it still standing, Argrave estimated its height at 12 feet. It had the same bulbous black eyes as on most of the creatures within Thorngorge. It was humanoid, but its flesh had uneven, clay-like burn scars marring most of its body. Its torso resembled a barrel on stilts, and both of its arms were very long and very thick. Each was about the size of Guilliman himself. It tried to use its arms to rise to its feet, failing in pitiful displays. Once that failed, it tried to grasp at the doorway, but it was just shy of grabbing it. As time stretched out, Argrave gathered himself and stepped forward, one hand raised as the creature writhed. His hand followed its head, a spell matrix forming as it did so. Seeing the light of the spell matrix changed something within it. The creature grabbed something, throwing it at Argrave. Guilliman swatted it aside with inhuman dexterity, but Argrave still flinched. It crawled back vainly, shifting debris aside and letting out noises not so distant from a dog's whimper. When its back hit the wall, Argrave saw his moment, and a spear of ice hurtled forth, taking the creature in the head. Its body convulsed once, and then came to be still. Argrave felt a strange sense of discomfort for but a brief moment, but he pulled his gloves tighter and walked forth. He checked with Guilliman to be sure that nothing else was in the room, and then proceeded in. Things had been shifted about by the creature's struggle, but it did not take him long to find a black box tightly shut with 2 metal latches. Though Argrave had expected Anneliese to ask about the multitudes of books destroyed in this room, she remained silent. Argrave could only open the black box in silence. The book was within, well preserved. Argrave opened it, and a matrix briefly projected itself into the air. After a thorough examination, he determined it was, indeed, the spell he was searching for. Right. Argrave shut the book, stowing it back in the box. "This is it. Let's be off." Glumman had been busying himself pulling his arrow from the creature's leg, succeeding just as Argrave said so. The elven vampire turned to look at him. "We're not going to be dealing with these creatures. It seems like something you do. They keep to themselves, and they don't grow in numbers." Argrave dismissed. "There's a reason this place hasn't been discovered yet. We can always come back at another time." He held out the box to Gilliman. "Carry this." "Let's go." Before Gilliman could take it, Anneliese took it from his hands. Argrave was puzzled but did not protest to the arrangement. They walked back, taking the same path they had when they entered. After the initial entrance, very few creatures bothered them. It did not take long before the grim citadel was left behind them. Gilliman shut the stone door, and it grated ever as loudly as it had the first time. Argrave stretched, feeling satisfied, but he heard something scrape the stone behind him and paused. There, Anneliese slumped against the wall of the ruins, hand held to her mouth as though nauseous. Chapter 67, Order of the Rose. Argrave approached Anneliese, who'd slumped against the wall, and put his hands on his knees. "Feeling queasy, or is it something else?" She nodded to his open-ended question with her hand still covering her mouth, so Argrave did not know what exactly was wrong. He knelt down, perplexed, and looked to Gilliman. He did not seem to have any idea of what to do, either. "Those creatures," she finally said, her voice no louder than a whisper. Argrave turned his head back to her. Her gaze was locked to the ground. "Do you know what they are?" "Is that a rhetorical question?" Argrave replied. When she didn't answer, Argrave said awkwardly, Well, they're creatures made by necromancy." "Are they alive?" she asked, her amber eyes finally lifting from the ground and locking with Argrave's own. "Can they feel?" "They're a soul locked in a vessel," Argrave explained. "That's the foundation of necromantic creatures. These ones have been sculpted to resemble horrors to damage morale. They're usually made from the corpses of the Order of the Rose's enemies." "No. I have seen other necromantic creations, fought against Vaidimon who turned to the darker magics in search of greater power. Normal necromantic creations felt nothing and displayed no emotion. They were but a vessel for the soul and magic." She ran a hand through her hair. "These things. They felt. They had emotion. They were alive." Argrave bit his lip, unsure of what to say for a time. He thought back to the creatures. Their appearances had been all but engraved into his memory. He felt an instinctual disgust seeing them in a new perspective, but he had been mentally preparing for that inevitability for months. He supposed that clinging to the notion that they were merely souls in vessels had been helpful, but Anneliese's insights unsettled him somewhat. When a long period of silence passed, Argrave tried to understand further, suggesting gently, "Be that as it may, they were trying to kill us. Surely their emotions couldn't be dissimilar to those during war. After Baden, you were fine." "What's different?" "It's not the same." She shook her head. "Not the same at all." She lowered her head once more, staring at the ground. Argrave knelt there, unsure of what to do. Eventually, Anneliese broke the silence. "When a child is born, they lack all the usual methods of communication we possess. They cannot speak, nor understand speech." She stared at Argrave. "As a consequence, the only way they understand others is through facial expressions, body language, or tone. One can make a baby cry by scowling alone. They experience emotions more intensely, and project them the same way. All I saw in each of those creatures was confusion, fright, dread, and pain. Each was projected with a childlike innocence." She lowered her head in defeat. "It probably sounds ridiculous, having seen them. They are abominations. You said so yourself, and I myself do not deny they appear and act abominable. But there is something in them that is unwitting and unwilling. Something with all the naivete of a baby." Argrave shook his head. "It doesn't sound ridiculous." Anneliese looked up at him, some measure of surprise on her face. "I won't act like I understand because I don't. I won't act like I felt it too, but I trust your abilities enough to believe you. That, at least, you can be sure of." Argrave lined it out plainly. "I see," she said, voice cracking. She stared for some time, and then nodded. "Thank you." "The question is." Argrave sat down. "What do you want to do about it?" When posed with that question, Anneliese's demeanor shifted. Her back, slumped against the stone wall, straightened, and her shaking slowed. Argrave had hoped it might have that effect. Rather than focusing on what she'd seen, she would focus on what could be done. Drastically different lines of thinking, and perhaps the route to recovery. She wrapped her arms around her knees and looked at Argrave levelly. "Do you believe we will see these creatures again?" "Inevitably," Argrave nodded. "Ruins of the Order of the Rose are everywhere, and many of them are inhabited with creatures like we saw and worse. In the future, I must enter more of them." Argrave turned his head to the stone door they'd left. "And once Gerektik Kiet has more influence in this plane, they will roam beyond the ruins. Their creators are all long dead, and he will assume the role of their master. Then I would like to know about them," she said resolutely. "Their makings, from beginning until end. Their creators, and if they knew their creations felt this way. I am certain their emotions are genuine, but beyond that, they are foreign." Argrave nodded. "Then I will tell you what I know. Perhaps, in time, you can learn even how to make them yourself." "I can make that happen." Argrave spoke calmly. The words made Anneliese frown, But Argrave carried on without heed. "I would not suggest it. It would be a waste of your talents. I would never create such things," she said firmly. "Oftentimes one cannot fully understand something until they do it." "I certainly didn't," he reflected, thinking back to the month he'd spent learning magic. His words sent Anneliese into a deep introspection, her amber eyes growing distant as she was lost in her own head. Argrave waited for a time, and then eventually spoke again. "I will explain all of what I know of the Order of the Rose and their nameless creations. If you still feel unwell, we can rest and talk for an hour or so. Otherwise, we will ride slowly back to Just, and I will explain what I know." "Dusk will be here in an hour." Glimmen finally broke his silence. "We'll be fine," Argrave dismissed. "Don't let that concern you. If you need to rest, rest." Anneliese shifted, and then rose to her feet. Argrave stared up at her from the ground. "Your words and consideration towards me are respite enough. I will follow your example." She offered a hand to Argrave. Argrave took her hand and pulled himself to his feet. "Then let's be off." Anneliese walked past Argrave, meeting with Gilliman and them moving towards the horses. Argrave cast one last glance at the stone door. "Babies, huh," he muttered. "Just when I was getting used to sleeping better." So, in essence, what divides the creations made by the Order of the Rose from other, less-aware necromantic creations is their permanence on this realm and their capability to perform independent action, Anneliese sought to confirm, speaking to Argrave on horseback. "Correct," Argrave nodded. "Can't know for sure why they do what they do. Maybe it's some last directive from the Order of the Rose. Maybe it's just their nature." All said, "The things we killed today have been wandering those ruins for hundreds of years." Anneliese digested the information in silence. Argrave turned away and watched the black box containing the spellbook for Electric Eel bounce up and down in tandem with Gilliman's horse. The box was strapped to the horse with a makeshift strap, and Argrave was somewhat concerned it would fall. "If they're capable of independent action, that difference has to come from somewhere," Anneliese reasoned, pulling Argrave from his concern. "Perhaps that cognition, no, that emotion, both enables them to act without direct command and experience life. Presuming one has a soul from birth, if a soul is used in the construction of a necromantic creation, it would be very similar to a baby's, inexperienced, naive." "Sure," Argrave agreed, finding no fault in the theory, "but I've told you all I know, so that is only conjecture. You now understand as much as I do, I think." "I see," Anneliese nodded, adjusting herself on her horse. Argrave turned his focus back to the road ahead. Their party finally neared the black walls of Just. Off to the side, Argrave spotted Foam Spire once again, and his gaze followed it. The sun reflected off its marble walls quite splendidly, and for a brief moment Argrave considered it was a shame that it would be falling into the ocean. "The you are," came a gruff voice from ahead, drawing Argrave's attention. Look at you, taking your leisure time." "I suppose I would be in no rush to return what's borrowed, either. But then that's my profession." A man with a pockmarked face sat on a tree branch, one leg bent atop it and the other dangling leisurely. "We spoke near a week ago." "You're Rivian's man," Argrave called out. "Here for Rivian's horses, I take it?" "Partly," the man nodded. Argrave and his party brought the horses to a stop just below him. He shifted, turning more of his body towards them. "Boss said he contacted some of the porcelain elves, just as you asked. They've been waiting for you before proceeding. Might be they've left by now. They're the skittish sort. They'll sail for their homeland at the drop of a shoe." "Cautious sort," corrected Gilliman. "We know well the cruelty of humans. Is that right?" The man proceeded. "You elves might well be bold in your own eyes, but being cautious of cruelty is just a polite way to say afraid." "I'm bold enough to put the ignorant in their place," Gilliman said, lowering the pitch of his voice until it was deep and guttural enough to make Argrave's hair stand on end. "Right, let's save the race war for another day and focus on the important stuff," Argrave interrupted before things could escalate further. "Mr. Man," Argrave said, not knowing the other's name. "Can you take me where I need to go?" "Sure," the man said, staring at Gilliman while grinding his thumb against his fingers. "I'll take you there." The man with the pockmarked face led them away from Just, walking against the fading suns. They headed in the direction of Foam Spire, where Argrave saw the light reflected off its surface gradually turn from orange to a deep, rich night purple. As ever, moonlight was plentiful. Their horses descended some rather treacherous cliffs, and as they proceeded further, the crashing of the waves grew louder and louder. Argrave recognized where they were going. A natural harbor formed within a sea cove. It was an unmarked location simply called the Smuggler's Cove in-game. After a bit of walking on the beach, the man leading them held out his hand and conjured magic to light the path. Argrave was somewhat surprised. He did not seem the spellcaster sort. Eventually, their escort paused, and the horses whinnied as they came to a stop. "Have to go on foot from here," the man said. "Leave the horses, I'll deal with them later." "Right." Argrave nodded and got off his horse, stumbling on the sand and rocks after having rode for so long. He stretched, legs feeling more than a bit tender. Gilliman held his horse's reins, standing just beside it. He took off the black box containing their electric eel spell, holding it in the crook of his arm. The elven vampire stared at the wall, eyes darting from place to place as he inhaled deeply. Hard to get an exact count, but there's a lot of people ahead, Gilliman muttered to Argrave. The salt masks the scent of their bodies, and the waves the sound of their movements. But I can still tell. There should be people, Argrave replied, uncaring of his volume. This place is a major interpot for the city in the shadows of Just. Ha! Their escorted laughed. You know your stuff. This way, then. The man waved them along, sliding into a narrower portion in the cliffs at the beachside. Argrave followed, winding through just behind. They had to proceed single file. Before long, their escort pushed open a wooden door, and Argrave stepped through it after him. The wet seaside rocks opened up into a great cove, probably near 50 feet tall. Rocks carved out by both water and man shielded them from the elements, the ceiling supported by old stone pillars. Sheer grey rocks formed a natural landing of sorts. Built atop the landing was a small yet well-constructed wooden harbour that had more boats than one might expect to see. They weren't grand vessels, but they were many. About what I expected, Argrave said, reminiscing. Been here? Don't remember you, their escort asked. You wouldn't. Argrave shook his head. The man stared at them. Right, sure, he said dryly. Let's go. Despite the fact night was falling, there were many people roaming the harbours. They were varied, some wealthy-looking nobles, some deplorable thieves. There were a great many simple stone buildings carved out of the cove's walls, square and uniform. This place, the architecture. Anneliese muttered. Indeed it is. Another ruin of the Order of the Roses. Argrave nodded. This place was an underground vault. Now, the years have eroded the cliffs and flooded the lower levels until it became this cove. The pillars are new additions, past 30 years or so. Seems you really do knows this place, their escort noted warily. Well, colour me surprised. You seem the blustering sort, not the type I'd expect to have the knowledge to back their words. He paused, turning. None of my business. That room, he pointed with his chin. Lady Elaine is waiting. Right. Argrave nodded, and stepped into the room as directed. Glancing about, he spotted Elaine and a few of Rivian's men, leaning on one side of the room with crossbows held idle in their hands. Elaine stood straight beside a familiar crate Argrave knew held illusion spells. Opposite them, two Vaidimans stood, arms crossed and backs straight. Between them was an old elf hunched against a walking stick. He turned his head at their entrance, and Argrave took a deep breath. Ro, Argrave greeted. Chapter 68, Breaking Walls. Look at him, Ro said, stepping towards Argrave. Elaine and the people with her shifted cautiously beside the shipment of illusion spellbooks. Goes white as a sheet when he sees me. That's just my complexion, Argrave returned. Argrave wanted to grit his teeth. Ro being here did not exactly scream peace and prosperity. He was an unpleasant zealot with the power of S-rank magic to back his zeal. It was a wonder Argrave didn't enter to find that a fight had broken out with Ro being the obvious winner. It was even more a wonder that Draz would send him here at all. Argrave dismissed his thoughts as the silence extended between them. What brings you to sunny Just? You must have missed me, that's my first guess. Oh, I missed your stupid jokes and vacant stare, the aged snow elf said harshly, walking stick echoing through the room as it impacted against the stone. Complete tribe. I came here on order of the Patriarch. Some things to do in this city of vapid morons. Elaine stepped forward and crossed her arms. Are we going to move this? Shut up, Ro said coldly, turning his head to Elaine. Speak. When spoken to, Elaine's expression turned to one of wrath, but Argrave held out his hand and grabbed Ro's shoulder. Be nice, Argrave said quietly. Might be you're the top dog in Vaiden, but you're only one of 3 S-rank spellcasters in this city. Even if your dragon came with you, I can't guarantee you'd walk out of this harbor alive if you cause trouble. When Argrave mentioned that Ro was an S-rank spellcaster, Elaine's rage turned to a steady caution. Ro turned his head back to Argrave. That true? Ro grumbled. Your kind live barely a quarter the time we do, but you've more high-ranking spellcasters. Using magic of higher ranking extends one's life, and we're far more numerous than the Vaidaman. Argrave shook his head. Argrave knew that Ro was much stronger than the 2 S-rank spellcasters in Just, but he did not care to let him hear that. This is what you would have gone up against had your invasion continued. What I did for your people was a good thing. I spared you an inevitable retaliatory genocide. I don't care to hear you praise yourself. Ro shook his head. I'll cause no trouble. I'm smart enough for that, at least. But that one isn't S-rank. He pointed his walking stick to Elaine. Her magic pool's only a bit larger than yours. Why should I respect her? I'm an exceptional case. Compared to most her age, Elaine is quite talented. Argrave shook his head. His magic had been increasing rapidly as he paid his debt to Earl Abney. One's magic capacity grew when expended, and Argrave expended his consistently to accommodate the blessing of supersession. Combined with rapid replenishing from the Amaranthine heart, it stood to reason he progressed faster. On top of that, she coordinates the Order of the Grey Owl here in Just. She's the only reason we have these books. Argrave frowned. It's common sense to offer respect when you don't know who someone is. Why are you so socially incompetent? Socially incompetent? Ro repeated. Few people are worthy of respect. Even fewer are non-Vaidaman. For instance, Ro stepped past Argrave, coming to stand before Gilliman. Gilliman. It's been some time, hasn't it? It has, responded Gilliman simply. The new warriors lack the steel with you gone, Ro said. Spiritless. No passion. None of the other commanders come to your ankles. Had you been leading at Madoth, the city would have fallen. Gilliman did not react to the praise, stating, I wish I had been. Vade decreed elsewise. Such is fate. Huh? Ro glanced at Argrave. So, you're tired of this dreg? No. Gilliman shook his head. He is the second I would serve not because of obligation alone. I believe he deserves your respect. Hearing Gilliman say that, Ro closed his mouth and took a deep breath. When next his white eyes fell upon Argrave, there was a subtle difference in his emotion, or so Argrave thought. Ro walked to Anneliese next. He sized her up. Seems you've improved your magic, if only just. You're a bit skinnier, perhaps. This one cannot feed you well, can he? She nodded. Argrave is a capable leader. The road has not always been easy, but I cannot blame the leader for a rocky path when that is precisely what I expected. Ro nodded, and then turned back. All right. Ro walked back to the two Vaydamen slowly. So, Elaine, he said the name harshly as though it was difficult to pronounce. Argrave is here, as you were waiting for. You'll give us the illusion books, finally, and end this pointless waste of time. I will. Elaine snapped, and her two men carried the box over. Once it was set down, Ro pried the lid open with his walking stick and removed one of the books. Perusing it, he checked a few more in silence, grumbling, and then took his stick back. The chest shut. It's sufficient, after what this one pilfered from us, Ro said with his lips upturned. He glanced at the two beside him. You two, do your thing. The elves with him grabbed the box and moved to leave the room. Argrave and company stood aside for their passage, and they left quickly. Argrave watched them head for a small vessel that did not seem to be Vaydamen in make at all. That was fitting. At least, they were trying to move unnoticed. You're satisfied? Argrave stepped forward, staring down at Ro. I seldom am, Ro said. But I need nothing more from the torch over there. He referenced Elaine's red hair. Hothead, that one. All my pride, 10th of my age, 100th of my accomplishments. She seemed fine to me. Argrave disagreed, looking at Elaine. She had her arms crossed, feet tapping quickly against the ground. We spoke earlier. I used my restraint. Ro rubbed his eyes. I'm too tired for indignance. He looked up at Argrave. We need to speak again soon regarding the interests of Vaiden. Where can I find you? Perhaps it would be best if I led you through Just, Argrave said delicately. I can't well leave an old man to wander through these dangerous streets alone. Someone might try and mug you, and you might immolate him in honor of Vade. This place isn't like that winter wonderland you call home. I'm not some animal that mauls things that come near me, boy. Ro shook his head. I can be discreet. I'm no lackwit. Just tell me where you live. Argrave sighed. The Knight's Pawn. It's an inn. Argrave gave him its rough location. He reached into his satchel and pulled out an iron circlet. It was what Argrave had been using to disguise his appearance. You should take this. Ro eyed it. What is it? Argrave put it on to demonstrate. Muddles the features. Very common thing in this city. Snow elves are not well liked here. It would be best if you did not stand out. Even hunched over and old, I tower above most. Ro rebutted. Not worth it. Take it, interjected Gilliman quietly. Ro glanced at Gilliman, and then begrudgingly put the circlet of disguise over his bald head. It's cold. Unpleasant. The aged elf shook his head. Whatever. I'll be waiting, Ro said, moving to leave. I haven't slept. Even if you're waiting in my room, I'll do that first. Argrave shook his head. So lazy, the aged elf muttered loudly as he walked out the door. Those words ignited a fire of anger in Argrave's chest and his vision narrowed, but then he acknowledged the absurdity of the claim. Argrave shook his head and laughed heartily. Watch your step, old man, he shouted after Ro. Don't forget your dentures. Elaine stepped closer to their party, arms still crossed. She let out a sigh, staring at the doorway Ro had left. You antagonize everyone, she noted. Why? Antagonize? It's just banter. I like making people laugh. Argrave paused for a moment, then added, mostly myself, granted. I think. She paused. I think that I was unduly predisposed against you. I apologize if I was brusque or dismissive in the past. Fancy words, Argrave commented, then shook his head. You weren't. Not especially. Even had you been, I don't care. I'm used to abuse. If there's one thing I can take, it's a tongue lashing. Not that you did, of course, Argrave added. Being a wiki editor was a very thankless job. Argrave would spend thousands of hours working on writing some obscure details for a game, and the only time people would ever reach out was to correct some minute mistake he might have made, and oftentimes, they weren't even right. Argrave sighed, wondering why'd he'd done it at all. Used to abuse, huh? Childhood memories? Elaine inquired. Something like that, Argrave replied vaguely. I've heard tell of King Felipe, she said. His true-born sons are treated harsh enough. I can't imagine what a Bbook. She trailed off, hesitant to finish the word. Well, Rivian and I were street orphans. Some parents. Sometimes I'm glad I had none rather than terrible ones. She stared off into the distance. It made us value independence early, at least. Left the both of us with paranoia. You can't trust anyone on the streets here. Rivian likes to mock people, and he never fully trusts any besides me. hold grudges. Argrave glanced over. Glad to see my swaying turned out to be worth the effort. She's opening up. I think this'll be useful. So your nobility comes from your own efforts? You two don't hail from some ruined house restored to its former glory? Argrave asked despite knowing the answer. Yes, she said pridefully. Rivian and I earned our surnames with our own two hands. We can't claim a storied lineage dating hundreds of years back. Very admirable, Argrave flattered. Few other nobles in Just agree, Elaine said to them. We're upstarts. Upstarts. Until you're standing above them and they need something from you. That's how it always is. She laughed. True enough. She looked at Anneliese. Something I should mention. I sent a letter to the council in the Tower of the Grey Owl recommending your friend, Anneliese, for membership. With both me and Castro contributing, I suspect the council will name her an honorary wizard of the order. A full member is a bit far-fetched. Really now? Argrave's eyes widened. That's... Thank you very much. Why are you thanking me? She said. It should be her that does. She pointed at Anneliese. It was my idea to begin with, Argrave said before Anneliese could speak. And it's mostly so I won't be expelled for teaching her spells. I see. You do much for the people you call your friends. She nodded. Consider it a favor for the business you've thrown my way. Those enchanted things from that elven tomb you gave me, I've got them in the right hands. In time, their worth will be evaluated. I can't promise it'll be quick. You said you were here for 3 weeks. So, 2 more left? I don't think they'll be done by then. Feasibly. Argrave nodded. That's fine. If they're not done appraising by that time, I'll leave them in your hands. In time, I'll come back and get them. Might be months. I'm a busy man. Argrave was not particularly concerned about the result. The majority of the items he knew could be found in those ruins were not especially jaw-dropping. The king's crown was the most notable item, and Argrave planned to hold onto that for a very long time. This venture was merely squeezing the most wealth he could out of what he did in the elven tomb. Elaine's green eyes gazed at him unwaveringly, and she spoke seriously. That's a lot of trust to show to the sister of a smuggler. Oh, you're right. On second thought, let's cancel all of our plans and never speak again, Argrave said sternly, then broke into a chuckle. Joking, naturally. Unless you plan to steal them all, I think it should be fine. Elaine pursed her lips, and then finally smiled. You're a very strange person. So I am often told, Argrave nodded. Now, I have a temperamental old elf to wrangle in the morning, and I need my beauty sleep to retain my razor wit. I bid you goodbye, Argrave waved, walking towards the door. Chapter 69, Lion's Paw. Stain straightened the ribbon he wore around his neck. His entire outfit, a gaudy thing of red and white, was quite stifling, in his mind. The stifling came from 2 aspects. It was mentally difficult because Stain loathed wearing the red and white of House Just. It was physically difficult because the outfit had been made for him 1 year ago when he was 15, and it did not fit as well as it did then. It had taken some time, but Stain had managed to track down Elias. It was important that he talk to him as Argrave had said, and even more important that he did so before Rivian. Stain wanted to be paid well for this job. The pay was nice, naturally, but the connections he might earn were more important. This Argrave seemed important. Damned bastard. Better pay me well, Stain muttered as he walked into the village. He kept his eyes on a white banner bearing a golden lion on it. Better line my pockets with velvet and gold and fill my mouth with caviar and cream. Him and his 2 elves, thin-wristed, dead-eyed. Stain continued to mutter as he walked down the simple dirt road of the village. The village was quite a humble place, with only dirt roads and wooden homes. The streets were filled with the occasional spilled grain from the recent harvest. The remainder had been placed into the granaries or kept in wooden barrels for temporary storage. Stain knew enough of the common folk to know that the harvest this year had been quite bountiful. It was a strangely optimistic portent for a nation on the eve of a civil war. The militiamen watched the harvest warily, for it was their village's lifeline in essence. What was watched more warily, though, was the large contingent of white armored knights standing just out front one of the larger places in the village. Stain loosened the white ribbon around his neck once, and then tightened it again, knowing he should appear presentable. When the white armored knights saw Stain, they knew immediately to pay more attention to him only by the way he dressed. Their gazes stayed all but locked on him as he approached, and even the villagers gave him a wide berth. If my brother were here, he'd say I look noble. Oh, Valedrian, you project a veritable aura of righteous honor. Stain made himself laugh as he imagined his brother's voice inside his head. If I was watching myself, I'd say that even pigs can dress in lace and pearls. Stain came to stand before the 4 white armored knights just out front of the building. He felt very short in front of them, a feeling he was well used to. Within, he could see many more knights enjoying a humble, if grand in size, banquet. Stain took some pleasure in seeing their white capes stained with mud, and their white metal boots lacking a shine. Hold, the first knight addressed. State your business. Stain put his hand to his chest in a somewhat out-of-practice noble salute. I am Valedrian of Just, Stain said smoothly. I would speak to Elias of Parban. The young lord has already received the invitation for the banquet in Just. His reply is not yet ready, the first knight answered, clearly the talker amongst the 4 of them. I come regarding more important matters, Stain said, doing his best to use more formal, proper speech. Something concerning your young lord. Something? Another knight repeated Stain's vague wording. You might be more specific. Yes, I might, if you'd just let me past so that I can speak to the one whose ear is worth bending, Stain said a little gruffly, then added in a more polite tone, my words are for the young lord's ears only. The two shuffled on their feet and looked at each other. Gods, Stain said impatiently. I'm only one person. Search me if you must. Have a mage examine me if you're paranoid. I'm sure your young lord has plenty of those in his honor guard. Parban has no lack of toady mages, unless your fortunes have shifted dramatically. You too, the first knight said. Escort him to the young lord. Watch him closely. Two of the knights nodded, and then moved to stand beside Stain as he proceeded into the room. Several gazes turned their way. The white-armored knights weaved through tables, leading Stain somewhere, though his escorts were especially mindful not to step on the white capes draped across the floor on account of the knights sitting on benches. Stain took no small pleasure in deliberately stepping on a few of them. They went to the second story of the building, making their way down the hall until they reached a door. One of the knights knocked on the door, waiting a few seconds before opening up. There, Stain saw a new group of people. These are the important ones in House Parban, whose asses are kissed on the daily by those below. Stain saw costly clothes, glistening jewelry, shimmering weapons, and well-polished armor. Everything in here was very expensive, and Stain's fingers twitched. After seeing their clothes, Stain saw the people that wore them. All of Elias' retinue sat by a round table with empty plates. Having just finished eating, there were 3 knights present, and Stain could tell they were dangerous. Their armor was quite grandiose compared to those downstairs, bearing a golden imprint of a lion decorating the front. Their swords shimmered red and cast light, obviously enchanted. Stain recognized one knight, a blond man with a broad build and a handsome face who had earned fame and wealth warring with the southern tribes, Baron Abraham. The other 2 in the room besides the knights were more lightly armored. One wore fanciful white clothing, and his red hair made Stain recognize him as Elias. The other was a skinny, middle-aged man in heavy leather robes. His hair was dark and had a sharp widow's peak, while his beard was cut to a sharp point. His eyes glowed with light and swirled with ever-shifting purple vortexes. Stain had seen high-ranking wizards before in Just, and he knew almost instinctively this man was one of them. He gave Stain a great deal of discomfort. Who is this? Why have you brought him here? Asked Elias, the first to speak. All heads had moved to the door long before they entered. Stain felt a little nervous, only a little. He tried to think about his brother, attempting to combat his nervousness with resentment. This one claims to be Valadrian of Just, and has some words for the young lord, a knight introduced, touching Stain's shoulder. Both true, Stain said clearly, stepping forth away from the knight's grip. Baron Abraham adjusted his seat until it faced Stain, watching cautiously. Elias leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. Valadrian. The name is familiar. You're the youngest in Just, if I remember right, Elias noted. He may be lying. He has no magic, young lord, and House Just is renowned for producing mages. The spellcaster with the purple eyes spoke. I have magic, Helmut, despite being the heir to a martial house. Let us hear him out, at the very least. Elias spoke with a natural authority that reminded Stain very strongly of his brother. The spellcaster Helmut nodded, casting his gaze at his empty plate before him. Elias continued. Thank you for bringing him here, he addressed the knights. You two may leave. The knights nodded and left. Now, Elias gestured, offering the sole empty seat to Valadrian. You may speak as though those present are absent. Anything you tell me will reach their ears regardless, so do not bother asking to speak with me alone. I'll stand. Stain refused. Brief message, anyway. Stain cleared his throat, then said simply, Argrave is in Just. He wants to speak with you before you make it there. Real important. The name alone elicited a much larger reaction than Stain had been expecting. Baron Abraham's face grew taut and angry, and he leaned forward on his chair. The mage Helmut lowered his head, chuckling, and Elias' face grew stern and serious. What does that bastard want? One of the well-armored knights said angrily. Don't call him that, Elias said quietly. What? Abraham turned around in his chair, facing back towards Elias. All due respect, young lord, but he crippled your sister and humiliated your father. We of House Parban have no reason to speak politely of him, be it in front of his face or behind his back. Stain tugged at his collar, feeling the room growing hotter. Crippled his gods. What have I gotten myself into? Elias looked at Abraham passively. I have come to know him. I will not say he is respectable, but he is not worthy of disrespect. Indeed, he has earned some goodwill from me. What in the God's name are you speaking of? Abraham stood, the chair thrown back to the ground. Elias also rose. The two stood across from each other, eye to eye. Come to know him? Do you mean you've fallen to honeyed words? Actions speak louder than words, young lord. He has brought only shame to Parban, the Baron continued. Your tone is bordering on insolence, Abraham, the spellcaster Helmut cautioned. It's fine, Helmut, Elias interjected. What happened to Rosalie was an accident. Argrave has made that clear to me, and I believe him. Elias tapped on the table insistently. Regarding other matters, My father was the first to wrong him. He escaped from my father to perform a greater duty, ending the Vyrdell invasion. A task which, need I remind you, he succeeded at. You believe those ridiculous rumors of him ending an invasion? Abraham's voice rose in volume. Stain took a step back, trying to blend in with the scenery. Another reason to hate gaudy clothes. They're designed to make you stand out, Stain lamented. They aren't rumors, Elias thundered. Don't speak of things you have no knowledge. I was in Mateth. I saw the measures he took. Elias stared at the great knight in the eyes unflinchingly, then harshly pointed at the chair. Now sit down, Baron Abraham. The Baron stared at Elias, eyes alight with a fiery wrath. Elias held his gaze just as unflinchingly, his ruby eyes seeming all too calm in the face of the renowned warrior's presence. Eventually, Abraham took his seat once more and finally broke his gaze off Elias. Elias shot his cuffs, and then slowly lowered himself into his seat. As calmly as though the confrontation had not happened, Elias looked to Stain and asked, "What did Argrave want to say?" "Ah. Right." Stain stepped forward cautiously. He. Stain paused, unsure of how much he should share. "He didn't give me any details at all, only that it was urgent and that it should be done before you enter Just." "I see. It's like him, sharing so little." Elias nodded once, then looked to Helmut. "I can agree to that. He did not ask me to come alone, I trust?" "No." Stain shook his head after a brief moment of thought. "It might be hard to do it quietly if you bring the whole party with you, though." "All the boys downstairs?" Stain pointed. "Not exactly stealthy. White sticks out, especially against the black Just." "You know this region. Where would be best, Helmut?" Elias questioned. There's a village I know. Garl, it's called. Should be fine to meet. Plenty public, but quiet enough to avoid attention. With me present, few can threaten you, young lord." "Sufficient," Elias concluded with a nod. "Can you convey this to Argrave, Valadrian?" Stain was slow to respond because he wasn't used to being called that name. "Yes, I can." "When would you be there?" "Tomorrow morning, I think." Elias looked to Helmut to confirm, and the spellcaster nodded. "Right, I'll tell him." Stain nodded. "And, sorry about your sister and your dad, whatever happened there," Stain added. The people in the room stared, saying nothing, and Stain nervously laughed before exiting the door. Chapter 70, Anneliese. Despite Argrave's concerns, Ro caused no significant disturbance. By the time Argrave had arrived at the inn they were staying, Ro had already elected to rent a room and spend the night. Glimmen decided to spend some time to be sure he caused no trouble and attend to his own blood-related needs. Like that, Argrave and Anneliese retired to their dormitory, ready to sleep. As Argrave sat in his bed, holding the spellbook that contained their electric eel spell, Anneliese walked over. Argrave looked up at her. "Something you need?" She crossed her arms. "Do you have a—" She paused, and then rephrased her question. "Are you tired?" "Always." Argrave nodded. "What do you need?" "Happy to help. I'd like to talk." She stared at him seriously. "How fortunate." "I'm good at that." Argrave gestured to his bed. "Sit, if you want." Anneliese hesitated for a moment, but then did so. Argrave looked down at her as she gathered herself. She was visibly nervous, as though she was preparing to give a speech in front of a great crowd. Argrave furrowed his brows in confusion, waiting for her to speak. "As you said, you are good at talking," she finally began. "In fact, your ability to manipulate with conversation is enviable." "Not a positive trait, usually." Argrave scratched the back of his neck. "I have a crutch. I know a lot of people more than they would expect me to. It's hardly fair for them." "I disagree." She shook her head. "At our first meeting, you compared our two situations. My empathic nature, and your vast knowledge of many people and things. They have some similarities, but on my end, despite being able to understand people well, I have never been able to manipulate well." "But one hand washes the other," Argrave countered. "In this short time, you've already been a tremendous help." "I do the talking, you do the discerning." Argrave held his hands out as though they were scales. "Partnership for the centuries." "I'm the Watson to your hole." "Well, you wouldn't get that one." "I have been thinking about how you dealt with Elaine," she continued. "I believe you used a phrase to describe it. To receive trust, one must show trust." Her amber eyes locked on Argrave's face. "And it worked, by my estimation." Elaine came around. "If you're trying to make my cheeks turn cherry pie red, you're on the right track." Argrave shook his head. "Like I said, I know her. I have a crutch. Anyone could have done what I did. I'm nothing. Despite your occasional shows of arrogance, you are rather terrible at accepting praise. Or taking credit," Anneliese noted. "No matter. I digress." She placed her hands on her knees. "To the point, then. Lacking manipulation skills myself, I have decided to shamelessly steal yours. I will show you my trust to receive yours." Argrave nodded, things falling into place. "The first move to open the puzzle box, that is me, I see." Argrave put his hand to his chin. "I don't think you understand the finer points of manipulation. Generally, you don't make people aware of what you're doing. Back when we were on Vyrdell, despite my grandmother's admonishment and my mention of my familial situation, you did not ask me questions. You restrained your curiosity. I assumed that you, perhaps, already knew of my family. It would not be beyond you. I don't. Argrave shook his head. That is good. She nodded and smiled. I have something to offer, then. My own situation. Perhaps. Indeed, it may well be a pointless thing to bring before you. But I wish to share it, if you are open to hearing it. I can't deny I'm interested. Argrave nodded. Then I shall begin. She nodded resolutely. Argrave waited patiently. Anneliese rubbed her hands together, staring at the ground. I apologize. I have never shared this, she said quietly. My name, as you may have noticed, is unusual amongst Veydaman. I was given a name from Berenda, because I was born in Berenda. I heard people mention that. Argrave nodded. My mother was married to my tribe's best hunter, she began. They established a contract before Veyta only love with each other. It is a common practice. She finally turned to Argrave. That man, though, is not my father. Instead, my father was the tribe's chieftain. I do not know the details, for it was the day of my conception, she said bitterly, as through the word bothered her. But while my mother's husband was away on a long hunt, the tribe's chief raped my mother, Cressa. She turned her head back to the ground. In the months to come, the tribe came to know she was pregnant. My mother's husband had been hunting such a long time that the whole tribe knew he was not the father. Argrave listened in silence, teeth clenched as his mind followed what probably ended up happening. Held in judgment of adultery by the very man who raped her, she was given a choice: acknowledge who the father was and join with him in matrimony or be exiled. She looked at Argrave. My mother chose exile. Did she not say what happened? Argrave inquired. She did. But the man was the chief, and power is power. Anneliese's eyes wandered, scanning the ceiling. My mother's husband believed her, though he was powerless to change the inevitable result. My mother was exiled. Her husband remained, forbidden from leaving as he provided much of the tribe's food. Pregnant and penniless, she wandered through Berenda. A kind village couple showed mercy on her and allowed her to stay until she gave birth. She named me after one of the people there in return for their kindness. Argrave took a deep breath. There was much in his head, but he knew it would be best to stay silent and wait for her to finish. We spent 7 years in that village, Anneliese eventually continued. My features. My mother, Cressa, has blonde hair and white eyes. I inherited all of my father's features. In that village, I learned the curse of my empathy. She placed her hand on her knees. When my mother looked at me, there was always some hatred in that gaze, and there was fear, anger, sadness. She showed love and hate in equal measure. Much of it was physical. Anneliese looked off to the side. I cannot blame her. Not exactly. Yes you can, Argrave wished to say, but he stayed quiet. It was the worst when I asked her about it. Why do you hate me? Why do you fear me? Often she did not realize herself she felt those emotions. Being confronted with them would inspire her wrath. She started to blink quicker, and Argrave spotted a faint glisten in her eyes that Anneliese tried to hide. That way, I learned to suppress what I expressed. Anneliese closed her eyes altogether, sitting in quiet silence. 6 years. It took for my mother's husband to succeed in having the exile revoked. Not for lack of trying, mind you, she added. Our tribe was the last conquered by Dras. It fell because my mother's husband gave an offer to Patriarch Dras, reveal the truth to the world, and revoke Cressa's exile. In return, he would betray his tribe. Cressa's husband butchered his tribe's chief in the battle to come. Without leadership, they fell to Dras quickly. When the exile was revoked, he left to retrieve Cressa. It took him months to find her, and months more to persuade her to return to Veyden. So, I spent the remainder of my childhood in Veyden, unwelcome both by my peers and my parent. To Cressa and her husband, I was the fruit of the worst moment in their lives. To my peers, I was the strange girl on the fence between human customs and Veydaman customs. My ability to know when they lied or how they felt only earned their enmity. In time, though, I found my place. Though I earned no friends, if I remained useful, I was given esteem, she finished. Her words did not sound sad or bitter, merely hollow. That is why I have endeavored to be the best spellcaster I can, and to learn as much of the world as I can. I know it was empty, and I know there was no love behind it. But the few times that my mother gave me praise was when I achieved acclaim as a spellcaster. Anneliese gazed at the floor vacantly for a time, then she finally turned to Argrave. There you have it. I have never confided that with anyone. It is nothing special and perhaps entirely undeserving of the ceremony I gave it, but it is my past. Argrave stared at her for a long time, blinking in silence as his brain worked on what to say. Finally, he furrowed his brows, and then leaned forward, placing his hand on Anneliese's shoulder. She was tense for a moment, but she relaxed in a second. I'm sorry you had to experience that, Argrave said quietly as they sat there. Having heard that, I can say this confidently, you're one of the strongest people I know. Despite having endured all of that, you're brilliant and open-minded. I don't know how you managed. I don't think I could have. I doubt that. She gazed at him. As child to King Felipe, your experience could not have been any easier. Argrave pulled away his hand from Anneliese's shoulder and turned his gaze away. The whiplash from that statement was somewhat overwhelming. It was a stark reminder that everything he was in this world was empty and hollow, and he was living a life that he had not earned. It was easy for him to play the role of Argrave, but if he stripped away the veil, nothing of substance stood beyond. Don't worry overmuch. Anneliese's voice broke past the haze of Argrave's thoughts. I did not do this expecting reciprocation. I merely thought it would be something I might share to demonstrate that I trust you. Argrave turned his head to look at her. Why do you trust me? Because you want me to, she returned. I'm not ignorant that you speak especially warmly to me and Gilliman. Notions of complete trust, friendship, consideration. I am not saying you do not hold these thoughts towards us, but I doubt that you would voice them were you not trying to earn our faith. You spoke that way towards Elaine, too, when you decided that she needed to be placated. Argrave straightened his back after being called out but did not deny it. It's natural for a leader to try and earn the trust of those following him, he defended. I'm not admonishing you, she reassured. I am only acknowledging. 3 knocks came at the door, drawing them both from the conversation. Gilliman would not knock. Argrave knew he would enter without a word. Argrave stood, placing what spell matrices he knew at the front of his mind. He was glad that the blessing of supersession had recovered. Argrave peeked open the door. He had to look down. There, a brown-haired man wearing worn red and white clothing waited. I found Elias, Stain greeted, a little out of breath. I hope you spoke to him as well, Argrave returned, opening the door. Stain walked inside. Yeah, naturally, you pisser. Stain only realized what he'd said after he said it and looked at Argrave warily, fearing retribution. Pisser, huh? Argrave chuckled. You're not wrong. Well, good work. Who all was with him? Stain hesitated, clearly taken aback by Argrave's demeanor. Well, don't you think I've earned some of that money you were talking about? Argrave smiled, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a pink coin. Suppose you've earned it. Argrave tossed it, and Stain frantically tried to grasp at it. Eventually Stain got his fingers on it, and he held it up to the moonlight coming in through the windows. Gods, you just carry one of these around? Now, who was there? Any names? Argrave pressed. Well. Stain gingerly wrapped the coin up in a cloth, and then stuffed it into his pockets. A weirdo mage with purple eyes, Baron Abraham, and more knights than he probably needs. Argrave stepped forward. Did you hear the name Helmut? He asked insistently. Yeah, Stain confirmed. Set up at meeting at some place called Carl. I know where it is. Dates tomorrow morning. Stain popped his fingers. Wish you'd told me you crippled this man's sister. Would have been nice information to have. Could have ended sourly. Helmut? Argrave said out loud as though it was unbelievable, entirely ignoring Stain. Why is he? Argrave paused and shook his head. Damn it. What? Did you cripple his children or something? Stain asked sarcastically. He seemed reasonable, just had some spooky eyes. A lot of high-ranking mages have weird stuff like that. It's the eyes that are the problem. Argrave took a deep breath and sighed. That one can see a lot of things he shouldn't. Gilliman opened the door, entering. He looked at Stain somewhat perplexedly. Stain returned his gaze with a good deal of fear. Ro is sleeping, Gilliman contributed. But I heard what you were discussing. When Gilliman said that, Stain was even more afraid of him. Argrave was ready to dismiss Ro. But then a thought came to his head. Might be we need to wake Ro up early. He might come with us somewhere tomorrow morning. Argrave smiled wide. Anneliese shook her head, and Gilliman looked confused. If you like this audiobook, subscribe the channel for more videos like this. And join my Patreon if you want to support me, where you can find the complete collection Jackal Among Snakes audiobooks. Hurry up, what are you waiting for? Leave some comment and let me know if you guys like this story, or you have a web novel you like and want to hear its audiobook. I will be happy to create them for you. Please like, share, and leave a comment on the video.